Chapter 23:58. Just as the old man, who had turned into a teenager, unleashed his power without restraint, the nearby cultivators reacted. In the blink of an eye, they had already taken action. Very soon, waves of perception spread over from all directions, unscrupulously searching for all the secrets in this place. Although the old man was very knowledgeable, he was still a mortal after all. His knowledge of the cultivation world was limited. At this moment, he only felt uncomfortable from being spied on, but he didn't think that almost all of his secrets had been exposed to other cultivators. At this moment, he was still wantonly venting the joy of regaining his youth. A miracle! A shocking miracle! The cultivators' consciousness surged, and their hearts beat wildly. The stone-like treasure was directly imprinted in their hearts at this moment, causing them to have an extremely strong urge to take it. With such an urge, there was nothing more to say about their actions. Very quickly, figures began to rush towards this location from all directions. Waves of unparalleled power repelled each other and kept rushing toward the old man. As soon as the old man obtained his power, he suddenly discovered that the void around him was violently distorting. An indescribable pressure was acting on his heart, as if he would be torn to shreds in the next moment and die a violent death. Who is it? He was instantly horrified. He could only instinctively activate the power of the stone in his hand. It produced a bright and dazzling light that was released wantonly, trying his best to block the many powers that were attacking him from all directions. The power released by the stone was naturally unparalleled. Just now, he had only revealed a trace of it, but it had already made him return to his youth, and he had even obtained the strength of an itinerant immortal. Now that he was crazily activating it, the effect was obvious. For a moment, the void trembled, and countless cracks erupted. The space-time instantly collapsed under the separation of these cracks, turning into countless space-time fragments that swept in all directions along with the shockwave. As the fragments swept across, the attacking powers were not stopped, but the old man's descendants were the first to bear the brunt. In an instant, all of his descendants nearby, whether they were warriors or ordinary people, were shredded by the countless space-time fragments. Not even dust was left behind, and they completely disappeared without a trace. Only at this moment did the old man realize what he had done. An indescribable pain welled up from the depths of his soul, causing him to howl uncontrollably towards the sky. Then, boundless resentment erupted, venting unreservedly towards the source of the many forces that were pouncing towards him from all directions. Boom, 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 boom. At this moment, an earth-shattering explosion appeared out of nowhere. The light released by the stone collided with the various forces coming from all directions, producing a continuous series of explosions. Although this location was several dozen kilometers away from where the old man lived, it was only near the city he originally lived in. At this moment, such a terrifying explosion occurred. The terrifying destructive power caused the surrounding small cities to shake violently in an instant. As it shook, the city walls began to collapse, and the buildings in the city began to disintegrate. Screams, cries, and curses could be heard from all over the city. Immediately after, the terrifying destructive power swept through the entire city, and the city completely collapsed along with the hundreds of thousands of residents in just a few breaths. The area within a radius of several hundred kilometers was completely flattened, and all traces of civilization were swept away. The scene was so tragic that it was not much different from what had happened at the harbor where the dark dragon hound was. The old man's anger and resentment were nothing to the other cultivators. Since they dared to snatch the old man's fortuitous encounter, they were naturally prepared to be resented by him. As for the loss of the small city nearby, it was even more insignificant to them. For these cultivators who wielded great power, mortals were nothing more than ants. If they died, then so be it. This caused the old man to become even more furious. After all, he had lived in the mortal world for close to 100 years, and he already had a house full of children and grandchildren. Apart from the children and grandchildren who had accompanied him, he still had hundreds of children and grandchildren in the city. At this moment, these children and grandchildren were completely annihilated by the attacks of the cultivators. One could imagine how agitated this situation was for him. At this moment, he roared furiously, "I want all of you to die." As he roared, the light released by the stone began to surge crazily into his body. His body began to grow at an unimaginable speed, and his aura continued to improve in a way that overturned the worldview of other cultivators. In just a few breaths, he had truly crossed the boundary between immortals and mortals, and became a real disbanded immortal. After that, he spent more than 10 breaths to advance his cultivation realm by another level, and he became a perfected immortal. After that, he became a golden immortal, then a Tai disbanded immortal in the end. He reached a terrifying level that was only a step away from becoming a Khanate Grand Luo. The extent of his improvement made the surrounding cultivators who were watching feel that their worldview had been overturned, and they felt that their knowledge of the world and cultivation seemed to have become a joke. However, at the same time, an extremely strong desire and fear arose in their hearts. Needless to say, the desire was obvious. Anyone who knew what it meant to become a Khanate Grand Luo would obviously desire such a powerful treasure that could easily improve a mortal to become a Khanate Grand Luo. On the other hand, fear was even more obvious. After all, they could understand a treasure that could improve a cultivator's cultivation realm by 1 or 2 levels. Even if they couldn't understand it, they could still accept it. However, this was a terrifying improvement that could allow an ordinary person to surpass a few dozen levels in succession. The might of such an existence had triggered the strongest vigilance in their hearts, and it allowed them to understand that once such an existence displayed its might, they would probably not even be able to retain their life brands. Naturally, fear arose spontaneously in their hearts. However, such an improvement was clearly not a normal one. Even Ergo had spent a few years and experienced countless life and death situations before he finally became a Khanate Grand Luo. This old man merely relied on the resentment and rage in his heart to forcefully stimulate such an improvement in just a few dozen breaths. How could it be possible that he didn't pay a price? At this moment, the old man's appearance had changed from that of a young man to that of an old man. Moreover, he seemed even older and more powerless than before he regained his youth. The power around him surged crazily, and he could not even restrain it. It constantly attacked the surrounding spacetime and caused great damage to other objects. The air in the void could not withstand the impact of his power at all, and it kept collapsing and being destroyed under the impact. He seemed like a moving source of destruction. As for the void, it kept distorting under the impact of his power, causing his figure to seem blurry as if he was living in another world. Die! The old man roared furiously. He raised his hand, and hundreds of streams of power were released from his body, pouncing towards the direction of the attacks that were charging at him earlier. The hundreds of streams of power did not restrain themselves at all. They released their powerful might without restraint in midair, stirring up the void and causing the void to distort intensely wherever they passed. It even caused the ground beneath it to continuously disintegrate and be destroyed, leaving only deep trenches on the ground, like scars on the earth. The ground began to shake due to this change, as if there was an earthquake. All sorts of terrifying sounds erupted from the void without restraint, and it felt like the end of the world had arrived in this area in an instant. The places that these powers passed through seemed to cover all directions of the old man, so it was naturally impossible for there to be no people in every direction. In fact, there were dozens of cities and villages in the directions that these powers passed through. These cities and villages were like pieces of paper to these powers. Wherever the powers passed through, they were completely destroyed, leaving behind only incomparably miserable ruins. The number of living beings that died had reached a point where even a stone-hearted person would be moved. All sorts of wailing, cursing, and roaring that had happened in the city that the old man was in began to appear continuously in these cities and villages. However, this time, it was no longer the cultivators who were greedy for the fortuitous encounter that the old man had, but the old man himself. There were quite a number of cultivators in the cities. Naturally, they were enraged to see their cities under attack. Thus, various kinds of attacks began erupting from the cities, assailing the incoming forces in an attempt to stop the incoming forces from crossing over the cities. However, it was a pity that the strength of a cultivator that was close to the connate grand heavenly realm was actually considered to be at the top of this world. Although this area was not considered remote, it was only a small place, and the cultivators who could live in seclusion in the city were at most close to the primordial heavenly realm. With such strength, what could they do against the furious attacks of the old man that was close to the connate grand heavenly realm? Most of them only triggered a small amount of the power to erupt, causing greater damage to the city. Originally, although the power passed through a large area, it was only a scratch. Compared to a city, it would at most destroy half of the city. However, after the power was slightly triggered, it was no longer just half of the city that was destroyed. Almost the entire city, along with some villages and villages around it, were completely destroyed. After hundreds of powers wreaked havoc along the way, they arrived at their targets one after another, and they blasted at the places where the greedy cultivators were located without holding back at all. Some of these cultivators were cultivators from sects, and some were lone independent cultivators. Some of them were the bases of sects, and they were protected by various formations. They still had some ability to resist these powers, so the damage they suffered was not too great. However, the situation was different for the other independent cultivators. After all, those independent cultivators did not have a strong foundation, and they only set up some defenses in their residences at most. They did not have much ability to resist the attacks released by these experts that were close to the connate grand heavenly realm, and they were directly wiped out for a time. All sorts of rumbling sounds erupted everywhere in this area. "How dare you!" Furious roars resounded from the cultivators of those sects, and they blasted towards the old man like rumbling thunder. Facing such resistance, the old man became even more furious. At this instant, he roared furiously, and a peerlessly powerful force burst out, charging at the surrounding void. After a large area of the void was blasted apart, his figure drew an extremely dazzling trajectory in midair, and he charged towards the place where the shouts were the loudest. Although he had attained a cultivation base that was close to the connate grand heavenly realm, the old man was just a mortal in the past, after all, and his control of power was horrifyingly poor. The marks left behind in the void were extremely obvious, and the loud rumbles could even be heard clearly from tens of thousands of kilometers away. As for the impact that was produced, even the ground began to shake and crumble under the impact. It was as if the world was being destroyed. Facing the old man who was charging over with such an imposing manner, the cultivators in that direction were both disdainful and horrified. They were naturally disdainful of the old man's use of power, but they were horrified that such a crude control of power could cause such terrifying damage. One could imagine how powerful the treasure he obtained was. If he was really allowed to unleash his power without restraint, would the mountain-guarding formation of their sects be able to withstand it? Crack, 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 crack. Their worries were soon realized. The old man had already gone mad because his entire family was wiped out. Now he had completely disregarded everything, and as long as he could use or manipulate the power he would pour it all at the sect without reservation. Even if the sect was guarded by a peak primordial unity pure sun expert, there was not much they could do against his brainless attack. Although the attack was crude and seemed to have many flaws that could be exploited, the old man's defense was just too strong, and his power was endless. However, the old man's defense was just too strong, and his power was endless. No matter how much he used, he would replenish it. If one attack did not work, he would use it again 10 times, 100 times. Chapter 23:59. They really don't have a moment to rest. One of the 3,000 cultivators in the highest hall sighed unhappily. As the people with the highest status in this world, the 3,000 cultivators took on the responsibility of protecting this world, so they naturally paid close attention to the various abnormalities in this world. As a whole, it was impossible for there to be no division of labor among the 3,000 cultivators. In reality, even though the 3,000 cultivators didn't have clear boundaries to divide up the areas they were responsible for, they were still responsible for areas that corresponded to their strength after repeated confrontations and battles. The one who sighed unhappily at this moment was the cultivator who was responsible for the area where the crazy old man was. His cultivation realm was already at the minor completion quasi-sage realm. He was not the strongest among the 3,000 cultivators, but he was not weak either. At the very least, he was considered a middle-level expert with this strength. The area he was responsible for had unknowingly become rather vast. At the very least, the area that the old man was in, including the area that the other cultivators were in, was only an extremely small part of the area that he was responsible for. Does it have anything to do with the predestined tribulations? A cultivator who was on good terms with him asked. Hearing this, the minor completion quasi-sage shook his head and said, "It's still too early for the predestined tribulations this time. It should just be an ordinary personal grudge." "Since it's a personal grudge, then there's no need to care about it," the cultivator who asked the question frowned and said. He was no longer interested. Although the areas that they were responsible for varied in size, from an absolute point of view, they were all extremely vast areas. In such a vast area, the number of living beings and cultivators had reached an unimaginable number. No matter how bizarre the grudges and disputes were, to them, it was already a daily occurrence that they could see every moment of the day. In this way, if they had to pay attention to all kinds of grudges and grievances, then even if they were all cultivators, they would still be exhausted. Therefore, they had unknowingly stopped caring about the personal grudges between cultivators. They only cared about whether these disputes were related to the predestined tribulations. Hearing his friend's words, the cultivator nodded and said, "Indeed. Although they've caused quite a ruckus, it's still a personal grudge. If I have to pay attention to this, then I don't have to do anything." As he said that, he shifted his attention away from the old man who was wreaking havoc below and began to pay attention to the other places in the area he was in charge of. He wanted to see if there were any factors that could trigger the tribulation. After searching for a while, he found nothing, so he withdrew his perception and began another round of cultivation. As for the destroyed towns and tens of millions of lives, they didn't cause any ripples in his heart at all. Because no one paid any attention to him, the old man who was the incarnation of the tribulation could unleash his advantage without restraint. In the end, he relied on his endless power and unshakable defense to spend several days to completely obliterate an entire sect, killing every living being within it. Then, he didn't stop. He turned around and headed toward the sect of the cultivator who attacked him. After spending a few more days, the sect was completely turned into ruins. After that, it was the third, the fourth. Only when the sixth sect was completely annihilated did the other sects panic, and they hurriedly joined forces to besiege the old man. At the same time, they started to move the old and young of their sects away to preserve the seeds of their sects. A great battle was triggered. The horrifying battle directly transformed this area into ruins, and the number of living beings that died exceeded 1 billion. The horrifying scene was sufficient to make any cultivator who witnessed this scene feel pity in their hearts. However, the deaths of these living beings couldn't leave any trace in the hearts of the enemies and allies that were engaged in battle. In their eyes, there was only the existence of each other. Everything else, even the billions of living beings, could not occupy even a shred of weight in their eyes. The final outcome of the battle ended with the old man breaking through the primordial Yang realm and truly stepping into the first heaven realm. On the other hand, the cultivators that besieged him were completely annihilated, and only their brands were left to return to the cycle of reincarnation. However, this also showed how astute and farsighted those sects were. After delaying for a few months, the old and young of the various sects had already fled this area. Even if the old man had become a true congenital golden immortal realm cultivator, it was impossible for him to find them and eliminate them by the roots. After completely annihilating all the cultivators that besieged him along with their sects, the old man's anger was slightly vented. Only then did he finally have the mood to look around and see the horrifying scene he caused in the battle. What have I done? The old man felt a wave of regret in his heart as he looked at the desolated area that had completely transformed into a scene of the end of the world. The power in his body, which he still could not control perfectly, began to inexplicably riot at this moment. It directly collapsed the void, turning a large area of land into nothingness, leaving not even the ruins of this large area. This change caused the old man to feel extreme pain in his heart. Although this place was no longer the city where his home was. However, if one were to expand one's vision, this place could also be considered as a part of his home. In this way, as he watched himself completely destroy this place, he felt pain as if he had suddenly discovered that he had personally sent his own country to its end. On the other hand, as a connate grand immortal realm cultivator who was unable to perfectly control his own strength, his regret and pain were sufficient to cause an extremely huge impact. It caused space to warp, and the laws to fall into all sorts of indescribable chaos that ceaselessly spread towards the surroundings. In the end, it caused this area that had already fallen into a scene of the end of the world to become even more chaotic. The area of the first heaven realm cultivator's power was extremely wide. The area within a radius of several tens of millions of kilometers was completely enveloped by the old man's uncontrollable power. Moreover, the area was being rapidly changed by this power, and it gradually turned into a scene that was similar to a land of death. As the chaotic power filled the old man's mind, his mind was affected instead. His will started to become more and more chaotic. In the end, he completely lost his mind and fell into a state of unconsciousness. As he fell into a coma, the stone that was still outside his body that brought him endless power and endless pain began to slowly melt. It slowly fused into his body and eventually entered his heart. As the stone entered, the tribulation aura deep within the old man's life imprint began to slowly swell. It felt like some sort of power was constantly replenishing the tribulation aura, causing the aura to grow stronger and denser. This change naturally affected his power, which in turn affected the spacetime and laws outside his body, causing the appearance of the region that spanned tens of millions of kilometers to slowly change. As the changes occurred, various indescribable characteristics gradually appeared in this area. Following that, in just a short few hundred years, the changes in this area accumulated to the point that the area seemed to have been completely separated from this world. The space inside the area became wider and wider as the changes occurred. From the outside, this area might only have a radius of several tens of millions of kilometers. However, in just a few hundred years, the area had grown to hundreds of billions of kilometers from the inside. The extent of this growth was enough to shock any cultivator. After several hundred years of evolution, the chaos within the area gradually formed an indescribable law, gradually forming a strange state between chaos and stability. This strange state caused all sorts of indescribable vitality to gradually appear in this area. This vitality constantly fused with the power in this area, gradually evolving into all sorts of strange life forms. It started to form an ecosystem that could not exist in the outside world, causing the area to gradually become filled with vitality. However, all of this had nothing to do with the old man who caused all of this. This was because the old man had completely turned into a huge mountain over the past few hundred years. He quietly stood at the center of this area, as if he was the most important pillar and core of this entire area. His consciousness was so still that it was as if he was dead. No matter how the outside world changed, he did not waver. Perhaps it was because his consciousness had become so still that the area could be in a state between chaos and stability. That was why a new ecosystem could form here, and why so many life forms were gradually born. From a certain perspective, the old man who had fallen into a deep sleep had become the heavenly Tao of this independent small world. More accurately, his life imprint had become the heavenly Tao of this independent small world. This was because the slumber of his consciousness allowed his life imprint to be released, allowing his life imprint to affect the outside world in the most powerful and direct way. If it was just an ordinary cultivator, the life imprint would at most affect the state of a certain area in the outside world with the essence of his life. At most, it would give the things within a certain range of his aura. However, he was not an ordinary life form. Instead, his life imprint contained the aura of a tribulation. The rich information contained in his life imprint was billions of times more powerful than that of an ordinary creature. It could even be said that it had formed a system of its own. Under such circumstances, the area that was affected by the complicated information in his life imprint would naturally show complicated changes. In the end, the area that seemed to be tens of millions of kilometers from the outside and hundreds of billions of kilometers from the inside seemed to have transformed into a complete small world. The changes here were naturally extremely miraculous to the cultivators in the outside world. During the past few centuries, countless life forms had used various methods to explore this place. However, due to the influence of the aura of a tribulation, none of them had obtained any great gains. Even the ones who had obtained the greatest gains had merely discovered that there was some sort of energy that could kill connate grand heavenly realm cultivators. It was precisely because of this that this area had unknowingly become a forbidden area for cultivators after the passage of hundreds of years, allowing this place to maintain its rare independence. During the time that this small world had taken shape, which was also hundreds of years after the old man had fallen into a deep slumber, Luo Fan finally found the third incarnation of a tribulation in this world. After that, another experience that resembled the rise of a legendary protagonist appeared somewhere in this world, causing familiar ripples to arise in this world that was originally chaotic but overall calm. After a few years, apart from the area that Ergo had established and the independent small world that existed between chaos and stability that the old man had established, a third area that was controlled by the incarnation of a tribulation appeared. After another few hundred years, the fourth incarnation of a tribulation was found. This seemed to have set a standard for the appearance of the incarnations of the tribulations. Every few centuries, a new incarnation of the tribulations would appear. In the end, when another tribulation descended in this world, almost 200,000 years after Luo Fan started searching for the incarnations, Luo Fan finally completed his inspection of all the living beings in this world. In the end, they found more than 900 incarnations of the tribulations. After Luo Fan found each incarnation, he'd obtained some sort of preparation that he'd made for the tribulation, and obtained all sorts of inconceivable powers and abilities. They caused great and small waves in this world, and provided rather interesting material for the spread of legends. The legendary experiences of these incarnations allowed them to achieve success and fame in the end, allowing them to establish their own forces or sects, or even to occupy a vast area by themselves and become the ruler of a certain area. However, there were also some incarnations that were either unlucky, too stupid, or simply too difficult to deal with, and even failed in the end because their opponents were too difficult. They either entered the cycle of reincarnation or became ordinary. Therefore, although there were over 900 incarnations, only around 700 of them were able to carve out a piece of land in this world and become the overlord of a certain area or existences with similar statuses. Chapter 2360. These nearly 700 regions had caused the entire world to unknowingly become divided and ruled by warlord. One novel. Under such circumstances, the 3,000 cultivators in the highest hall had unknowingly lost control over the world. Before this situation took place, the 3,000 cultivators' control over the world could be said to be truly powerful. At that time, any of their wills could cause a huge echo in the world and cause a fundamental change in the situation of the world. However, once such a situation was formed, any of their wills had to be monitored by the numerous tribulations that were the overlords of the world. In other words, they needed their consent. Once the wills of the 3,000 cultivators deviated from the will of the overlords, then the wills would naturally be distorted to a certain extent, and only then could they be realized in this world. Some wills were even directly repelled by the overlords' wills. As a result, only a small portion of the preparations that the 3,000 cultivators had made to deal with the next tribulation in the past 200,000 years could be carried out completely. Most of the preparations had been used by the overlords, and they became tools for them to seek their own benefits. It was not surprising that this happened. After all, to the incarnations of the tribulations, the rise of every single one of them had actually been covered in blood, and they carried with them innumerable injuries. With such a background, they were naturally indifferent to everything in the outside world. Unknowingly, they were filled with an indescribable resentment towards the entire world. Because of this, even if the 3,000 cultivators clearly stated that these preparations were for the safety of the world and the survival of the world, they would not take it to heart. If they were in a good mood and the preparations did not harm their interests, they would naturally not be stingy in carrying them out. However, if they were in a bad mood, or the preparations would offend their interests, then they would obviously not cooperate. This situation appeared and developed bit by bit as time passed. When the 3,000 cultivators felt that they could no longer do anything about it and that the situation had gone out of their control, they could no longer reverse the situation. Damn it! If I had known this would happen, I would have wiped them out from the start. The 3,000 cultivators in the hall had ugly expressions on their faces. One of them, a minor completion quasi-sage, was even roaring in anger. Just now, this minor tier sage-to-be had ordered an overlord in his territory to set up a formation at a certain location to deal with the impending calamity. However, he didn't expect that the overlord would use the location as an excuse to refuse his order. How could he not be furious? However, that overlord was still a sage-to-be even though he was slightly weaker than the minor accomplishment sage-to-be. Moreover, because he'd controlled that area for a long time, he'd almost completely fused with it. He could destroy that area with a single thought, so this minor saint couldn't do anything to him. Don't they know it's for this world? He didn't even look at the big picture. Damn it! Damn it! The minor accomplishment sage-to-be roared furiously. His voice reverberated in the hall, causing it to tremble slightly as if it would collapse at any moment. Clearly, his anger wasn't just because of the overlord's refusal this time. Instead, it was because of the resentment that he'd accumulated in the many overlords in the past. At this moment, it finally erupted, causing him to lose his composure. Hearing his roar, the other cultivators empathized with him, and were all indignant. At the highest position, the peak sage-to-be who was about to step into the pseudo-sage realm snorted. His voice was like a bucket of cold water being poured over them. All the cultivators felt their minds clear up, and the anger in their hearts disappeared in the blink of an eye. When all the anger disappeared, the cultivators all smiled bitterly. Without anger, they could naturally see the situation clearly. They hadn't intervened in advance. Now, when those overlords had truly matured, they'd already lost the chance to make up for it. Among those overlords, almost all of them were already at the pseudo-sage realm. Not to mention the fact that there were even great perfection quasi-saints among them, who could suppress 99% of the cultivators in the hall facing them, unless the 3,000 cultivators abandoned all conflicts and disputes and united to suppress them. It would be impossible for them to be effective. However, even if that was the case, when the overlords united, their suppression would turn into war. And it would be a terrifying war that would affect the entire world. Perhaps their war would cause unimaginable damage to this world before the tribulation arrived. It was even possible that this world would be destroyed even before the tribulation arrived. Under such circumstances, what else could they do but curse a few times? Forget it, I'll explain it to him in detail again. After all, this isn't for myself, but for the world. The minor accomplishment sage-to-be sighed and murmured. His consciousness left the hall and descended once more, heading towards the overlord who had just rejected him. As for whether he succeeded or not, it could be seen from the fact that he roared and flew into a rage not long after. Thankfully, for some unknown reason, this tribulation has been delayed for so long. If it had only lasted for tens of thousands of years like the past, things would have become troublesome. The other cultivators felt an inexplicable sense of entanglement in their hearts. With those overlords holding them back, only 20% to 30% of the preparations they'd made over the years could be carried out. If the tribulation had only taken tens of thousands of years like before, one could imagine the fate of the world with just 20% to 30% of the preparations. Fortunately, they'd had 200,000 years to prepare. Even if only 20% to 30% of the preparations were carried out, it was enough to forge the world into an iron bucket. It was enough for the 3,000 cultivators to be confident that the world could survive this tribulation. Below them, in the largest force, Ergo lay quietly on a cloud bed, watching the countless beautiful female cultivators performing in the air. Below him, a large number of cultivators were gathered, chatting, laughing, and cheering in the hall that was built in midair. Ergo was no longer the child that Luo Fan had discovered. He was now a greater accomplishment sage-to-be. He was even one step away from becoming a peak quasi-saint. Just his cultivation alone was enough for him to become an expert who could suppress most of the world. Not to mention that he had countless civil officials, generals, and experts under him. Now, the force that he had established had become the absolute overlord of this entire world. In the central continent, it occupied close to 1/10 of the land, forming an almost completely independent kingdom. Any other overlord would have to bow down to him obediently if they were to face him. As for the 3,000 cultivators in the Supreme Palace, they were nothing more than chickens and dogs in his eyes. If it wasn't for the fact that the peak quasi-saint was too powerful, he would have already fought his way to the 3,000 cultivators and overturned them. At this moment, a cultivator arrived in front of Ergo in a flash, bowed, and said, "Supremacy, the 3,000 cultivators sent another order. They want us to cooperate with them in setting up a formation. Should we respond?" Upon hearing this, Ergo merely smiled and asked, "Who contacted you?" "It's the second cultivator," the cultivator replied. The cultivator was a handsome man who looked to be around 23 or 24 years old. His cultivation realm had already reached the lesser accomplishment sage-to-be. In this world, he was already comparable to some of the overlords. However, he was merely a servant in front of the dark dragon hound at this moment. He did not even dare to raise his head when he was reporting to the others. Ergo sneered and said, "He's just a lesser accomplishment sage-to-be, there's no need to pay attention to him." Hearing this, the cultivator nodded and immediately left. He didn't find Ergo's decision inappropriate at all. Not many cultivators in this world knew the names of the 3,000 cultivators. However, this didn't mean that Ergo didn't know their names. After all, he was the most powerful overlord in this world in terms of strength and influence. It was not his first time dealing with the 3,000 cultivators, so he naturally knew the names of the 3,000 cultivators, as well as their cultivation levels. However, due to his disdain for the 3,000 cultivators, he ranked them as the first cultivator, second cultivator, and third cultivator. He even asked the cultivators in his faction to address them as such. As such, every time he dealt with the cultivators, as long as his subordinates reported their names, he would be able to know their ranking and determine if they were qualified to listen to him. Clearly, as far as he was concerned, the peak quasi-saint was the only one among the 3,000 cultivators worthy of his cooperation. Everyone else, even the intermediate quasi-saint of the second path of cultivation, was nothing more than an ant to him. They weren't worth his time or energy. After the cultivator left, Ergo did not care about what he said at all. He only looked at the singing and dancing performance with a smile. Occasionally, he would tease his subordinate. He seemed to be quite relaxed and content. For cultivators, the boundaries of time were blurred. A gathering and a song and dance performance could take several years. Although Ergo's gathering this time wasn't as exaggerated as this, several days still passed in the blink of an eye. On this day, when the performance reached its climax, a powerful aura suddenly descended from the sky, directly pressing down on the entire palace that was built in midair. The sea of clouds instantly collapsed from the pressure, turning into billowing smoke that rushed in all directions, causing the entire palace to shake. In the face of this change, all sounds in the hall were silenced. Whether it was singing, music, laughter, clinking glasses, or even breathing, they all disappeared. It was as if the hall had been emptied. Seeing this, Ergo frowned and sneered. "You've gone too far." "Too far?" A voice came from the void and entered the ears of all the cultivators, causing an indescribable fear to rise from the bottom of their hearts. Along with this fear, many cultivators in the hall began to show fear on their faces. Some of the weaker ones even began to tremble. Ergo swept a glance at his subordinates, who were like partridges, and felt even more unhappy in his heart. With a snort, the ground of the entire palace flickered and a massive invisible energy was born. With a sweep, the terrifying aura that filled the entire palace was completely swept away, restoring the palace to its original state. As the aura was swept away, a silhouette started to materialize in the void, gradually appearing. It was none other than the strongest among the 3,000 cultivators, the pinnacle quasi-saint who was about to step into the false saint realm. At this moment, the pinnacle quasi-saint clearly wasn't here in person. It was just a manifestation of his power. However, the manifestation of his power alone was enough to bring great pressure to everyone present. Even the dark dragon hound felt an indescribable pressure coming from the figure in front of him at this moment. Facing this figure, no matter how arrogant he wouldn't dare to lie down on the cloud bed like before. At this moment, he slowly stood up. The aura on his body began to rise, and in the eyes of others, his entire person began to expand crazily. In the blink of an eye, he had already expanded from the appearance of a normal person to the appearance of a giant that could support the heavens and earth. Of course, this was only on the surface. In fact, his figure didn't change at all as his aura changed. The land within billions of miles of the palace began to tremble slightly. It was as if endless power was flowing into the palace through some indescribable and mysterious channel and into Dark Dragon Hound's body. Gaga gaga, all sorts of subtle cracking sounds came from the space between the peak of the Sage-to-be and Dark Dragon Hound. Cracks kept appearing as if time and space were about to break apart. With the support of the vast land, Ergo was able to fight the pinnacle quasi-saint who was about to step into the false saint realm as an equal. He wasn't at a disadvantage at all. Chapter 2361. "You can give it a try," Ergo said with a smile. After 200,000 years of cultivation, he had almost completely drawn out all the potential of the stone that had fused with his heart. He was no longer the person who only had strength but no realm in the past. Now, his strength had reached the greater saint stage, and his realm had even vaguely surpassed it. In this way, he was confident enough to face the pinnacle of the sage-to-be. Not to mention that it was only the incarnation of the pinnacle of the sage-to-be who was here. Under such circumstances, he was naturally even less afraid. The pinnacle of the sage-to-be frowned even more deeply when he heard this. It was impossible for him to completely disregard the life and death of this area that occupied 1/10 of the central continent. After all, there were billions of living beings in this area. If he were to completely destroy this area first, he might be able to completely sink this world into the abyss without the arrival of the tribulation. The tribulation is coming. Now, all living beings are in the same boat. If you make any mistakes, you'll be the one to suffer losses. At that moment, he acted as if the previous conversation had never happened and directly stated the purpose of his visit this time. Ergo said disdainfully, "That's the same old excuse again. Don't you have a new one?" He did not care much about the life and death of this world. As the embodiment of the tribulations, although he was not completely assimilated by the tribulations and saw everything in the world from the perspective of the tribulations, he could not have a strong sense of responsibility towards the world like a normal living being. He did not feel that the life and death of the world needed him to contribute. To him, it didn't matter if the world was good or bad, it couldn't affect his mood. If he was in a good mood, he might be of some help to this world. If he was in a bad mood, he might stand on the side of the tribulation and destroy this world. In this case, how could he agree with the words of the pinnacle of the sage-to-be? Seeing Ergo's stubborn behavior, the pinnacle of the sage-to-be suppressed the urge to crush him and said, "This is not just an excuse. Do you think you can survive if this world is destroyed? So what if I live? So what if I die? I've lived for such a long time. I've enjoyed everything I could and encountered everything I could. The only thing I haven't encountered is death. It wouldn't be bad if I could die." The dark dragon hound chuckled. There was an inexplicable madness in his eyes. Even the peak quasi-saint couldn't help but be shocked by this madness. His eyes became extremely solemn as he said, "You really don't want to cooperate?" Hearing that, Buttface came back to his senses and chuckled. He even withdrew the aura of the earth power that he had gathered in the area that he ruled. He said, "Forget it, I was just scaring you. I'm in a good mood today, so I'll go along with your wishes." Seeing this, the peak quasi-sage heaved a sigh of relief. He thought that Buttface's behavior was the willfulness of a ruler. He nodded and said, "If that's the case, I'll send someone to find you. You don't have to look for me. Look for that one. I'll leave this matter to him." Buttface casually said to a cultivator who was sitting down like a partridge. The cultivator was a connate golden immortal. In the outside world, he could already be considered as an expert. However, in this place, he was nothing more than a middle or lower level cultivator. He was only slightly stronger compared to the servants who were performing or serving during the banquets. This kind of existence should never have gotten his turn to complete this mission. The pinnacle of the sage-to-be was naturally dissatisfied when he glanced at the cultivator. However, he knew that although Buttface was temperamental and stubborn, it would not be easy to make him change his mind. Since he said that the cultivator would be in charge, it was obvious that he had to be the one in charge. He merely glanced at Dark Dragon Hound coldly and nodded before disappearing in a flash. Following his disappearance, the vast and unparalleled aura that filled the entire palace disappeared without a trace. The entire palace returned to its original state. However, it was impossible for songs and dances to appear right away. After all, although the aura was nothing to Buttface, it was as terrifying as an ordinary person being suppressed by a boundless ocean for the other cultivators in the hall. They would need some time to recover, and it was impossible for them to recover as soon as the aura disappeared. At this moment, the cultivator who was pointed out by Buttface came up to Buttface to ask for his instructions. If the destruction is not great, do as they say. If it's too great, just ignore them. That was Buttface's only instruction for the cultivator, and he sent him away. The cultivators sternly nodded in response to this order. Buttface could ignore the 3,000 cultivators, but he could not. With Buttface's instruction, he knew what he had to do next. Not long after, the atmosphere in the hall gradually returned to the state before the peak quasi-sage arrived. Laughter and cheers began to appear in the hall again. All sorts of songs and dances were played in the void again. In just a few minutes, it was as if nothing had happened. While the dark dragon hound was fighting against the peak sage-to-be, one of the 3,000 cultivators who was in charge of a certain region started to have a headache. That place was none other than the second incarnation of the tribulation who had a fortuitous encounter. It was an old man whose descendants had been completely erased in that fortuitous encounter in the past 200,000 years. This strange little world had already improved by leaps and bounds. Compared to before, its surface area had expanded by hundreds of times. It seemed to have a radius of billions of kilometers instead of tens of millions of kilometers. That was only what it looked like on the outside. Inside, the small world had expanded even more. Now, this place looked like a boundless world. At first glance, it was even vaster than the outside world, of course. The interior of the small world was still the same as before, between chaos and stability. It was in a strange dynamic balance. However, apart from these similarities, there were also some differences from before. That was, there were countless living beings here. Moreover, all of them were fundamentally different from the living beings in the outside world. It felt like they were living beings that could only exist in another perfect world. These living beings lived in this world that was between chaos and stability. However, they did not seem to be chaotic or strained at all. It felt like the living beings in the outside world were living in the outside world. The countless strange living beings even developed civilizations that were fundamentally different from those in the outside world. There were all sorts of strange cultivation systems among them, as well as complex and complete kingdoms. Countless cultivators were born there. If one did not know that this world was just a small world that was separated from the outside world, one might think that this was a perfect world. In the center of this world, there was a mountain that looked like a human sitting cross-legged, like a pillar that could suppress the world. That was the body of the old man. In the end, I still can't get around it. This place is completely independent. Although I've made a lot of preparations, I still can't break it. There will still be loopholes in the end. The cultivator from the highest hall hovered in the air outside the small world and thought to himself. The cultivator's cultivation had reached the intermediate stage of the demi-saint stage. Even among the 3,000 cultivators, he was considered a top-notch existence. In this world, he was only second to Dark Dragon Hound, the most powerful overlord in this world. However, he seemed hesitant at this moment, as if the decision he was about to make was extremely important. In fact, it was not as if he was hesitating. The decision he was about to make was extremely important. The small world in front of him had been constantly developing and expanding over the past 200,000 years. Now, it had almost become a malignant tumor of the entire world. Although they had made all sorts of preparations for the small world over the years, even setting up hundreds of millions of formations around it and preparing countless techniques, they could not stop the small world from expanding. In fact, they had even used various methods to enter the small world and made many arrangements to deal with the tribulations. They had left behind various divine abilities, formations, arcane treasures, powers, and various other existences to deal with the tribulations that might appear in the small world. But now, after deducing again and again, he realized that all his preparations were still insufficient. The biggest problem with this small world was its own existence, not what was inside or outside of it. As long as the small world existed, it would make the world incomplete. It was like a small hole in a complete egg. Yes, the world's ability to withstand tribulations would be weakened by hundreds or thousands of times. Under such circumstances, No matter how he arranged the formations inside and outside the small heaven and earth, left behind divine abilities, power, and magic treasures, it was impossible to completely eliminate the hidden danger caused by the whole and make the heaven and earth bear the tribulation to the same degree as before the small heaven and earth existed. After deducing this fact, the cultivator had no choice but to come and discuss it with the owner of the small world, even if he was unwilling. Invite the owner of the small world to come and meet me. The cultivator sighed and transmitted his voice into the small world. The voice contained the powerful essence of a mid-tier quasi-saint, and it possessed unimaginable power. After entering the small world, it began to reverberate in the small world. It was as if the entire small world was filled with earth-shattering thunderclaps. Scram! At this moment, a cold shout suddenly came out from the pocket dimension and turned into a boundless shockwave that rushed towards the cultivator. The impact was so powerful that it even created a powerful ball of mud in the void. It even caused the laws of the world to crack. Even though he was already a mid-tier quasi-saint, the cultivator still had to deal with this impact with full concentration. Countless rays of light flashed within his body and formed mysterious trajectories in the void. He struggled to move the impact away so that he would not be affected by it. It seems that you have woken up. After moving the impact away, the cultivator transmitted his voice again. In that case, why don't you come out to meet me? I have something to discuss with you regarding the survival of this world. What does the survival of this world have to do with me? If you don't scram, then you will stay here forever. The voice came from the small world again. Moreover, after the voice spread out, it turned into a terrifying impact that continued to charge towards the mid-tier quasi-saint. This time, the impact was many times stronger than before. Even though the mid-tier quasi-saint was extraordinary, he could not completely offset the impact. The countless rays of light that he released collapsed rapidly under the impact. His body was also sent flying, forming a long trajectory in the void and flying hundreds of millions of miles away. Wherever he passed, the void cracked slightly. Countless small cracks in the void lasted for a long time before they gradually closed up. Blarg! The mid-tier quasi-saint spat out a mouthful of blood. The blood kept exploding in the air, turning the void into powder that kept surging like smoke. Damn it, even the Alliance Lord can't reach this level of strength. After coughing out a mouthful of blood, the intermediate stage quasi-sage's complexion looked slightly better and he cursed. The Alliance Lord he was referring to was naturally the strongest among the 3,000 cultivators, the peak quasi-saint who was about to step into the false sage realm. There was no need to mention the source of this judgment. Although there was a huge gap between him and the peak quasi-saint, he had been with the peak quasi-saint for hundreds of thousands of years and had a certain understanding of the peak quasi-saint. However, he already knew that even if the peak quasi-saint wanted to deal with him, he would not be able to rely on just his voice. After cursing like this, his expression sank into hesitation. Clearly, he was hesitating whether he should try to communicate with the owner of the small world again. If he tried, given the temper of the owner of the small world, he might really be killed. However, if he didn't try again, the impending tribulation would bring far more destruction to this world than he had expected, given the flaws created by the small world. When that time came, not only would he die, but all living beings in this world would also die. After pondering for a long time, he finally sighed, "In the end, I still can't steal my heart." Chapter 2362. Although he was rather fearful of the master of that pocket world, his sense of responsibility eventually suppressed this fear. He braced himself and returned to the pocket world to summon the master of that pocket world again. If the world is destroyed, this pocket world will be destroyed as well. Don't you care about the survival of this pocket world? He sent a voice transmission into the pocket world. At this moment, the sound transmission caused the energy in the entire pocket world to become chaotic. Although it didn't break the balance between chaos and stability in the pocket world, it still caused the entire pocket world to tremble in a strange way. Scram. At this moment, another shout came from the pocket world. Following this shout, a boundless and terrifying power was released from the pocket world and started to rush towards the intermediate quasi-saint. Although the intermediate quasi-saint had almost thrown caution to the wind, he was still fearful of death and could not risk his life completely. Therefore, before he spoke, he was already prepared for the worst and was on guard against the attack of the master of that pocket world. Under such circumstances, although the power released from the pocket world was terrifying, the intermediate quasi-saint had already taken action the moment it arrived. Rays of light were released from his body. Above his head, a strange treasure that looked like a cloud appeared out of thin air, and it began to resist the terrifying power with all its might. However, it was a pity that even though his technique was brilliant, it was still a little lacking compared to the power that was being released from within the pocket world. Under the impact of that power, the brilliance emitted from his body was completely torn apart. The cloud of mist above his head also completely collapsed. It felt like he had completely perished, although the intermediate quasi-saint had only suffered a little bit of the impact. His body shook violently and blood gushed out continuously. Even at this stage, the intermediate quasi-saint had no intention of giving up. He continued to shout, "I only need to modify the formation. It won't hurt you at all and I don't need any help from you. I just need you to let me do whatever I want." The voice continued to be transmitted into the pocket world, shaking the entire pocket world. Scram! At this time, the same voice that had already sounded twice came from the small world. Compared to before, the sound this time was even louder and more impassioned. The shock it gave off was even stronger. Then, more and more powerful energy was released from the small world and transmitted towards the intermediate quasi-sage. Seeing that the intermediate sage-to-be was about to die under the might that was dozens of times stronger than before, a figure suddenly appeared beside him. With a wave of his hand, the overwhelming might disappeared as if it had never appeared. This figure had the appearance of a middle-aged man. His appearance was dignified, and his eyes shone with boundless wisdom. It was the peak sage-to-be who was about to become a pseudo-sage. "Do you want to die?" After the peak quasi-sage swept away the incoming power, he turned around and shouted at the intermediate quasi-sage who had just escaped death. Hearing this, the intermediate quasi-sage smiled bitterly and said, "Thank you for saving my life, Alliance Master. I don't want to court death either. It's just that the more I think about it, the more I feel that there are too many flaws in this place. If we welcome the tribulation in this state, this pocket world might be seized by the tribulation immediately and become the base camp of the tribulation's power." The peak quasi-sage's expression changed slightly when he heard this. Although he had learned about this pocket world before, it was an extremely special place in the central mainland after all. Even though he was in charge of the overall situation, he couldn't help but notice its existence. However, because he was in charge of the overall situation, he didn't study the situation of this pocket world too deeply. Most of the tasks were given to this intermediate quasi-sage. Of course, this didn't mean that he didn't attach importance to this pocket world. From the fact that he had given this pocket world to this intermediate quasi-sage, who was considered a top existence among the 3,000 cultivators, it was clear that he actually attached great importance to this pocket world. After being reminded by the intermediate quasi-sage, he suddenly realized that there was such a serious hidden danger in this pocket world. If this small world was allowed to continue existing like this, it might really become the carrier of the power of the tribulations in the end, and the consequences would be even worse for the already severe tribulations. Damn it! Why didn't you think this through before making this arrangement? The peak quasi-sage shouted angrily, wishing that he could wipe out the intermediate quasi-sage around him. Hearing this, the intermediate quasi-sage looked regretful and said, The master of this pocket world is too difficult to communicate with. Even setting up these preparations has already exhausted his patience. How can I make deeper arrangements? Hearing this, the peak quasi-sage's face didn't look much better. He still looked at the intermediate quasi-sage with an extremely serious expression. No matter what the reason was, this pocket world could be regarded as a self-defeating arrangement. It was the fault of the intermediate quasi-sage. You don't have to worry about this. You can go back now, he said to the intermediate quasi-sage coldly. The intermediate quasi-sage opened his mouth, but could only sigh in the end. He bowed and turned into a ray of light that shot up into the sky. In the blink of an eye, he disappeared into the void and returned to the highest palace in the depths of the void. Seeing that the intermediate quasi-sage had left, the peak quasi-sage's eyes shone with an extremely dazzling light that shone directly into the pocket world. The moment the light from his eyes came into contact with the small world, a sizzling sound came from the small world. Then, he could faintly feel that the strange laws inside the pocket world started to become slightly chaotic. The peak quasi-sage's cultivation realm was now about to reach the false sage realm. It went without saying that he had amazing eyesight. With a glance, he saw through the essence of the barrier. He knew that although the barrier seemed powerful, it was extremely fragile. With the power of the master of the pocket world supporting it, it could naturally exist for a long time. It could even possess various characteristics that ordinary barriers didn't have. However, once something happened to the master of the pocket world, the barrier would completely collapse. When that happened, the laws inside the pocket world would collide with the laws of the outside world. It would result in an earth-shattering explosion. It naturally wouldn't be enough to destroy the entire pocket world, but it would be enough to change the ecological environment of the central continent. There was no need for other changes. Just this alone would be enough to destroy billions of lives. As someone who felt that he had a great responsibility for this pocket world, the peak quasi-sage obviously couldn't let this happen. The first thing I have to do is to strengthen the barrier. I have to completely cut off the connection between the power that originally supported the barrier and the master of the pocket world. Only then can I talk about other things, the peak quasi-sage thought. With this thought, he took action without hesitation. With a wave of his hand, an infinite amount of power was generated in the void and began to combine in an extremely complicated and mysterious way. In the end, it transformed into some kind of indescribable light. It suddenly fell down and landed on the barrier of the small world. It began to spread in all directions and gradually dyed the barrier of the small world with this kind of light. At this moment, a painful roar suddenly came from the pocket world. Immediately after, waves of unparalleled power erupted from the barrier, continuously attacking the spreading light that was gradually dyeing the barrier with a mysterious hue and expelling it. However, although the power that burst out of the barrier was powerful, it couldn't compare to the light created by a peak quasi-sage who was about to step into the false sage realm. The final result of this resistance was only to slightly hinder the spread of the light. It couldn't make the light disappear. Who is it? A loud interrogative voice suddenly came from the pocket world. This voice was filled with boundless anger and doubt, forming a rolling sound wave that spread in all directions. A large area around this pocket world was barren. Apart from the natural scenery, there were no traces of civilization. The closest trace of civilization was hundreds of thousands of kilometers away from this pocket world. Besides, the traces of civilization in this area were also left behind by mortals. There were very few traces of cultivators, and they could even be ignored. If one wanted to find traces of cultivators, they would have to continue to walk hundreds of millions of kilometers in all directions. The reason for this was very simple. It was because this pocket world was too unfriendly. All along, this pocket world had been emitting some kind of chaotic power from time to time, stirring up the world's origin chi within a certain range, and even disrupting the laws within a certain range. This kind of change did not have much of an effect on ordinary living beings. After all, mortals relied on eating and drinking to maintain themselves and improve themselves. The changes in the world's origin, chi, and laws did not have much effect on them. However, for those cultivators, the effect was obviously not so small. For those cultivators who absorbed the world's origin chi and comprehended the laws, this kind of chaos was completely unbearable for them. In this area, they had to be vigilant of the changes in the outside world at all times. If they did not escape from the chaos of the world's origin chi and laws, what awaited them would be the chaos of the power in their bodies and the chaos of their comprehension. In serious cases, the chaos might even directly tear their bodies apart and cause their souls to scatter, causing them to die a violent death. It was exactly because of this that there were only mortals and no cultivators within a radius of several 100 million kilometers. Fortunately, the changes that occurred in this small world at this moment and the various terrifying sounds that came from it did not cause too much chaos. Otherwise, after hearing such a huge monster being so angry and wreaking havoc, the panic alone would be enough to cause severe chaos. In that case, those knowledgeable people wouldn't be surprised even if the tribulation descended ahead of time. It's not up to you to be willful now. This concerns the life and death of this world. I'll do it even if you don't want to, the peak quasi-sage said faintly. His voice was not directly transmitted into the pocket world like that of the intermediate quasi-sage. Instead, it was spoken in a very normal way. It even felt like his voice could not be heard from more than 10 meters away. However, it was clear that to the small world, or at least to the owner of the small world, this sound was not an obstacle at all. After the voice spread out, a furious roar was heard. This is my world. The fate of this place is decided by me. No matter who you are, get out of here. Amidst the furious roar, the figure in the center of the pocket world, that looked like a huge mountain, began to tremble continuously. Soon after, as a series of explosions rang out, the mountain rock on the figure completely shattered, revealing the figure of an extremely old man. In the eyes of the pocket world, this old man was like a giant god who could support the heavens and the earth. When he slowly stood up, it was like a god of creation who was responsible for the world was slowly standing up. There were countless strange creatures in this pocket world, as well as a huge civilization. At this moment, countless living beings began to worship the giant. Reverent prayers came from all directions, entering the giant's ears and circling around him. Obviously, to all the creatures here, the appearance of this figure represented the appearance of the god of creation in their myths and legends. This was enough to make even the most rational living beings prostrate themselves in worship. However, the old man did not pay any attention to the voices of worship. At this moment, his face was filled with pure anger. He raised his hand and made a grabbing motion. An incomparably huge walking stick appeared in his hand. The crutch was so huge that it was like a towering mountain. Just the tip of the crutch alone was as big as a huge continent. Its material seemed to be made of wood, metal, or some kind of strange stone. It looked extremely strange. Chapter 2364. What's going on? Alliance Lord. Is there a change in the tribulation? A cultivator hurriedly asked. Hearing this, the peak quasi-saint nodded solemnly and said, That's right. All the results we've deduced about the tribulation are useless now. Now, the source of the tribulation is right in front of us. The cultivators who set up the formation were horrified when they heard this. However, before they could ask, the peak quasi-saint had already closed his eyes and released his control over the formation. He carefully deduced all the information at this moment, deduced the various tribulations, and deduced how to deal with this extremely strange tribulation. Seeing this, the other cultivators didn't dare to be negligent. They hurriedly urged their energy to maintain the formation that the 36 of them had set up. Although the pinnacle quasi-saint had extracted his mind to deduce all sorts of information about the tribulations, his power was still connected to the other cultivators, and he was still supporting the formation that sealed the small world. Therefore, these cultivators didn't need to waste too much energy to take over the task of the peak quasi-saint. All they needed to do was to divert some of their consciousness to help the peak quasi-saint maintain the formation. This wasn't difficult for them, but it wasn't easy either. Therefore, they didn't have the energy to question the peak quasi-saint at this moment. They could only obediently maintain the formation according to the peak quasi-saint's arrangement. The peak quasi-sage deduced for 2 hours. During this process, his expression kept changing. Sometimes he was happy, sometimes he was troubled, sometimes he was hesitant, sometimes he was in pain, and sometimes he was relaxed. After 2 hours, he opened his eyes with a solemn expression and said, "Everyone, do as I say." As he spoke, he split his consciousness into 35 strands and sent them into the minds of the 35 cultivators who were surrounding the small world. As the strands of consciousness were transmitted, the 35 cultivators all showed signs of understanding. Clearly, they understood the peak quasi-saint's thoughts. After understanding this, they showed a hint of hesitation on their faces, as if they had some opinions about the peak quasi-saint's thoughts. However, they clearly didn't have any better ideas to execute. Although they were hesitant, they could only agree with the peak quasi-saint's arrangement. Immediately, the crowd looked to one another and nodded. The power within their bodies began to change. As their powers began to change, the spirit array they had constructed began to change as well. The originally almost completely sealed state began to gradually change, gradually transforming into a kind of communication and transit function, becoming a buffer layer between this small world and the outside world, allowing the power in the small world to flow out after a certain conversion and merge with the outside world. After this change, the cracks that appeared on the barrier of the small world began to increase and expand. From its original almost non-existent state, it began to strengthen again. It continued to split open, and incomparably chaotic energy began to rush out from within, bombarding the formation constructed by the 36 cultivators. In an instant, the 36 cultivators, including the peak demi-sage, felt a terrifying impact on their bodies and the power within them. Pu-pu-pu-pu-pu-pu. Countless strange sounds came from within their bodies, as if something extremely faint was constantly exploding inside their bodies. Following this sound, the cultivators all revealed looks of pain on their faces. Some of them even had blood seeping out of the corners of their mouths, looking extremely tragic. The outside world constantly shook during this process, and the various preparations that the 3,000 cultivators had constructed over the past 200,000 years began to shake continuously. The many formations, powers, abilities, and magic treasures that had been connected to this formation were constantly shaken. The void continuously collapsed and shattered, creating countless strange cracks. As for the space that could still be maintained, the space within a radius of hundreds of millions of kilometers began to collapse, and the living beings within this area were continuously destroyed and dying due to this collapse. Seeing all of this, the 36 cultivators who had set up the formation all had expressions of pity on their faces. Their sense of responsibility made them grieve over the death of those living beings. At this moment, rays of light rushed out from the depths of the void. Following these rays of light, the countless preparations that the entire world had made over the past 200,000 years were activated at the same time. It wasn't just the preparations that had been made within a radius of hundreds of millions of kilometers around this small world, but the preparations that had been made across the entire central continent and even a huge number of islands in the ocean. At this moment, the entire world began to shine brightly. Countless mysterious rays of light shot into the sky, making the entire world seem like it was completely condensed from light. Following that, all sorts of violent tremors began to appear on the many rays of light. All of the rays of light were shaken by some invisible force, and as it shook, so did the land that it covered. The rays of light that rushed out from the depths of the void were cultivators one after another. They were the 3,000 cultivators in the highest hall. Clearly, they had also received the thoughts of the peak quasi-sage just now, and they all took action at this moment. At this moment, the old man in the small world suddenly became extremely calm. The endless baleful aura that covered his body began to thin out, as if it was gradually dissipating. However, the peak quasi-sage had a look of pity on his face when he saw this. This was because he could tell that the baleful aura did not dissipate. Instead, it had broken through the old man's defenses and began to enter the old man's body. In other words, the old man's defenses were completely ineffective. At this moment, he had been eroded by the baleful aura and became the carrier of this tribulation. Come on, let me see how powerful this tribulation is. At this moment, the peak quasi-sage had a strong fighting spirit on his face. Although he had lost his composure because of the sudden change in the tribulation, he was still a peak quasi-sage who was about to become a false saint. He was a powerful existence who had held the highest authority in this world for hundreds of thousands of years. After the shock, his fighting spirit was reignited, and he no longer had any thoughts of retreating. So, this is my destiny. After all the baleful aura entered the old man's body, the old man spoke slowly. As he spoke, his body began to recover from its original hunched state, and his body began to recover its youthful appearance. The huge walking stick in his hand completely collapsed at this moment, turning into boundless chaotic energy that merged with the boundless chaotic energy in the surroundings. In the blink of an eye, it disappeared without a trace. After doing all that, he suddenly lifted his hand and tore it apart. The barrier of the small world that was constantly cracking had completely collapsed and turned into countless fragments. The chaotic energy that was originally charging out at a rather slow speed was like a flood that had broken through a dam. It charged towards the surrounding formation without holding anything back. In the blink of an eye, it had already caused the formation to swell by 1,000 times. There were faint signs that it was about to be torn apart. As for the 36 cultivators who set up the formation, their bodies trembled at this moment. Even the one who suffered the least injuries had half of his body completely destroyed. As for those who were severely injured, their entire bodies had collapsed, and it seemed like they had been completely wiped out. Fortunately, the peak quasi-sage had already adjusted the formation, converting the power that was originally absolutely sealing the formation into a transformation of the power, which greatly reduced the impact. Otherwise, the impact alone would have been enough to completely tear the formation apart, and more than half of the 36 cultivators here would have been wiped out. However, even so, they felt extremely uncomfortable at this moment. They only felt endless pain from the bottom of their hearts, causing them to almost completely lose their perception of the outside world. Outside the formation, due to the sudden increase in the power that suddenly surged out by 1,000 times, the space-time within a radius of hundreds of millions of miles was completely shattered. Everything within it, including the laws and laws, was completely destroyed, causing the space-time within a radius of hundreds of millions of miles to seem to have turned into chaos once again. At this moment, the old man who had turned into a young man did not care about the formation at all. He merely threw his head back and roared, causing the entire world to violently tremble. In the void, countless strands of malevolent aura appeared out of thin air in almost every corner of the world. They either fused into the bodies of living beings, into certain objects, or even directly into the laws and space-time. With this change, the entire world fell into absolute chaos in the blink of an eye. The living beings who had been fused with the malevolent aura began to have incredibly strong destructive desires, destroying everything in the world and slaughtering the living beings around them. The laws and laws that had been fused with the malevolent aura began to distort, creating all sorts of strange powers on their own to destroy everything in the world. There was no need to even mention the space-time that had been fused with the malevolent aura. It directly turned from calm to violent and began to slaughter, destroying everything within its range, and not just everything in the world. In just the blink of an eye, the entire world had fallen into a state that was more dangerous than any of the previous tribulations. Why is this tribulation completely different from what we predicted? In the deep abyss of the savage lands in the southwest of the central continent, the leader of the alliance formed by many living beings with the marks of chaos said in surprise, "Leader, what did you say? How is it different from what we predicted?" A living being beside him asked. The tribulation this time should have been the same as before. It should have started from us, and then spread to all living beings in this world who possess our characteristics, the Alliance Lord said with a frown. As he spoke, he looked at the old man who did not have much of a presence in the past 200,000 years. At this moment, the old man was also confused, as if he could not make heads or tails of what was going on. Seeing this, the leader frowned and said, "You don't know what's going on either?" The voice directly reached the old man, jolting him out of his almost non-existent state. Only then did the many strange living beings in the abyss notice his existence. Shocked and enlightened gazes gathered towards the old man from all directions. Clearly, many living beings had figured out why this would happen at this moment. "I really don't know what's going on," the old man said. After answering, it muttered as if to itself, "Things shouldn't be like this. It's still a long time before the second great tribulation of heaven and earth. All the tribulations before the second great tribulation of heaven and earth should be created by the world to digest us. Why would such a tribulation appear?" Its words caused the eyes of the strange creatures in the surroundings to be filled with shock. It was the first time they heard the truth about the tribulations. "You're not talking nonsense, right? How could the previous tribulations be like this?" A living being impulsively asked. The old man did not pay any attention to the question. He only pondered and calculated. The living being who asked the question waited for a long time but did not get a reply. He could not help but become furious. He roared and was about to charge at the old man to teach him a lesson. At this moment the leader said, "Stop. Now is not the time for internal strife. We must figure out what's going on. Perhaps this is a great opportunity for us." At this moment it seemed to have figured something out. Its eyes were sparkling with an incomparably strong hope. The solemn and unconcealable despair in its eyes had completely disappeared at this moment and was replaced with an incomparably strong fighting spirit. A will to fight against the heavens and earth. Opportunity? The other living beings were all confused. Amidst the confusion, they all felt an indescribable anticipation rising from the bottom of their hearts. The Alliance Master seemed to have said something similar last time, and at that time, they had indeed obtained a certain amount of benefits, allowing them to avoid the fate of being destroyed in the calamity. They were able to escape the calamity early and live until now, after 200,000 years. With such a precedent, how could they not be excited when they heard the same words again? "Leader, what's your plan this time?" a living being quickly asked. An indescribable smile appeared on the Alliance leader's face as he said, "This time, it must be the natural enemy." Chapter 2365. "I see. Indeed, that's the only way this can happen," the old man murmured. His eyes grew brighter and brighter, and an eagerness gradually seeped out of his body. It started to affect the surrounding creatures and even changed the atmosphere in the abyss. "Then what should we do?" the other creatures asked hurriedly. Hearing this, the old man only smiled and said, "We need to seize this opportunity. This is the best chance for us to return to our original selves. It's also the best chance for us to transcend the catastrophe." These words made the blood of the other creatures boil, but they became even more anxious because of this. It was such a good opportunity, so what should they do next? After saying so much, this was the main point. There's a high possibility that this tribulation will develop into a great tribulation of heaven and earth. As long as we participate in it at the right time, we will be blessed by the great tribulation of heaven and earth. At that time we might be able to surpass ourselves, the Alliance Master said. Compared to the old man, who had only relied on the various experiences he had accumulated over a long period of time to make various judgments, the Alliance Master had the information that Luo Fan had imparted to him back then. Thus, his thoughts were much sharper and more agile than the old man's, allowing him to think clearly and give an answer faster than the old man. Many creatures were pleasantly surprised. They wanted to rush out immediately and receive the blessing of the catastrophe of the world. When is the right time? Some creatures asked impatiently. Not yet. When the time comes, I think we will all feel it. The Alliance Master calmed down and smiled faintly. As he spoke, he looked up into the sky. His eyes seemed to see through the boundless darkness and the endless shadows behind the darkness. He saw a huge shadow that shrouded the entire world. That was the shadow of a natural enemy. The Alliance Master had rather complicated feelings towards this natural enemy that had favored him more than 200,000 years ago. It had a kind of inferiority complex, a kind of worship, and a kind of subtle jealousy towards him. As for the natural enemy's favor, he sometimes felt honored. He felt that it was extremely lucky to be favored by the natural enemy. However, there were times when he felt inexplicably dissatisfied. He felt that the natural enemy completely disregarded his dignity by treating him with such a high and mighty attitude, but no matter what kind of emotion he felt, he had no doubts about the natural enemy's power. He absolutely believed that the arrangements made by such an existence couldn't be ordinary, nor could they be easily dealt with. It was precisely because of this that he made such a judgment just now, and it was also why he was so confident that they would definitely sense it when the time came. The old man didn't refute the Alliance Master's words. Instead, he nodded in agreement with a look of anticipation on his face. Let's wait. I don't think we'll have to wait too long for the right time to come. It mumbled, and the power within its body began to surge. Its body began to become stronger as the power surged. Its body, which was originally suppressed, was gradually filled up. Its aura also began to skyrocket, continuously charging at the abyss, charging at the hearts of all living beings within the abyss. All of the living beings were stimulated by its aura, and an indescribable fighting spirit surged in their hearts. They also started to circulate their strength and did their best to adjust their condition, allowing their bodies to gradually approach the most perfect peak state. Although the changes in the abyss were huge, they were extremely hidden. At the very least, the living beings outside the abyss didn't pay any attention to the changes here. At this moment, what the living beings above the abyss were paying attention to was the increasingly intense and shocking chaos that was occurring in this world. This chaos caused all the living beings to fall from their originally peaceful state into chaos. It was as if the entire world had fallen into the path of the end of the world in the blink of an eye. Under such circumstances, they didn't even have time to pay attention to themselves and the world. How could they have the time to pay attention to the various changes that were occurring in the depths of the Southwest? In reality, the wildlands had been the focus of the 3,000 cultivators in the past 200,000 years. Among all the preparations they had made, most of them were placed in this wildlands. After all, even though they weren't able to fully comprehend the specific manifestations of the tribulations, based on their previous experience and the encounter they'd had, they were able to roughly confirm that the tribulations that were born in the heavens and the earth had an extremely high probability of originating from the wilds in the Southwest. With this understanding, most of the preparations they made to deal with the tribulations were naturally for the various abnormal changes that might occur in the wildlands. At this moment, when the entire world was filled with baleful aura, countless arrangements were activated. The entire wildlands was also enveloped in boundless light, as if it was tightly wrapped by countless threads. However, the amount of baleful aura here wasn't much more than the amount of baleful aura in other areas. In fact, the amount of baleful aura here seemed to be much thinner than the amount of baleful aura in other areas. Under this change, the baleful aura in the wildlands started to change in a way that was completely different from the baleful aura in other parts of the world. The baleful aura in other parts of the world would expand as time passed, and the range and depth of the baleful aura would increase. However, here, the baleful aura was actually in a stalemate with the various arrangements. The baleful aura couldn't destroy the various powers, abilities, and treasures that were set up, and the various arrangements couldn't completely destroy the baleful aura either. Because of this, the battle here became more and more exciting compared to other places. Originally, there should have been at least 10 cultivators from the highest palace in this wildlands to preside over everything. However, due to the abnormal change in the tribulations, only one cultivator could descend to preside over the various arrangements here. The various arrangements that were originally prepared for 10 cultivators could only be presided over by one person now, so naturally, there would be a lot of mistake. This caused this cultivator to be extremely tired, and he was more than 100 times busier than he had originally estimated. The tribulations this time actually changed like this. Damn it! We should have eliminated the signs of a separatist regime when they appeared. The cultivator's heart was filled with displeasure as he struggled to resist the attacks of the beings that had been corroded by the baleful aura in the depths of the wildlands. Clearly, he had pushed the cause of the change in the tribulations onto the incarnations of the tribulations that had split up the world with their own forces. His thoughts were clearly the thoughts of the majority of the 3,000 cultivators. After all, the biggest difference between the development of the world before and before the last tribulations was the appearance of these overlords who had obtained all sorts of fortuitous encounters. Aside from these, there were no other factors that were powerful enough to cause such a huge change. It was precisely because of this that it was extremely normal for them to blame the appearance of these overlords for the change in the tribulations. Of course, from a certain point of view, they had guessed correctly. At this moment, a strange feeling appeared in the cultivator's heart. It was as if a strange existence that was even more detestable than the tribulations had suddenly appeared in the world. What is this? After all, this cultivator was already a minor completion quasi-saint, and his control over his mind had already reached an unimaginable level. However, at this moment, he instantly felt the change in his heart. He realized that this sudden feeling should not have come from the bottom of his heart at all. Kill. His eyes gradually turned red, but his heart gradually turned cold. An inexplicable conflict appeared in his heart at this moment. It made him stay here to resist the various effects and damages caused by the baleful aura in the wildlands, or to leave this place to attack the overlord that he cared about and hated more for the past 200,000 years. This isn't my will. He stopped moving, his body trembling slightly, and his eyes were red as he spat out these words with difficulty. While he was struggling, he suddenly had a flash of inspiration, and he suddenly understood what was going on. This is the influence of the tribulations. Just when he understood this point, he suddenly realized that there was an indescribable evil aura continuously being produced in his body. It gradually spread out from his body and began to accumulate around his body. It looked as if there was a cloud wrapping around his body. This appearance had clearly confirmed his previous guess. He had indeed been affected by the tribulations, or rather, he had been eroded by the baleful aura. His clarity did not last for long. Soon, as the baleful aura became denser, his consciousness was completely filled with the hatred for the overlord, and he completely lost his rationality. As his last trace of clarity disappeared, he suddenly let out an earth-shattering roar. As he roared, his power erupted wildly, and an unparalleled aura spread out in all directions without reservation. As for the various arrangements made by the 3,000 cultivators in the wildlands, they were completely torn apart in an instant. The incomparably dazzling rays of light that existed in the wildlands were all torn into pieces by this change. It looked as if fragments of light were falling from the sky and scattered on the ground. The destruction of these arrangements was naturally a great disaster for the world itself, causing the malevolent aura to surge out in all directions without holding back. It began to connect with the malevolent aura from other regions, creating an inexplicable resonance between them. They mutually boosted each other and gradually began to rise, becoming denser and denser, stronger and stronger. At this moment, the minor achievement sage-to-be, who was supposed to be controlling the various arrangements, had disappeared without a trace. He had arrived at the area ruled by the overlord closest to the wildlands and charged straight at the overlord's encampment. An incomparably ferocious power erupted from his body as he charged straight at the overlord. This overlord was only a minor achievement sage-to-be, which was a level lower than the minor achievement sage-to-be. In the face of such an attack, the overlord could not use his own power to resist. Therefore, at this moment, he did not hesitate to activate the various preparations he had made in this large area. He gathered the power of the entire area and directly blocked the incoming force. Crack! Crack! At this moment, an earth-shattering explosion erupted. The impact of the two forces created an unimaginable shock wave that swept out in all directions. The ground where the two forces came into contact was completely torn apart, wiping out hundreds of meters of the ground. Not even a speck of dust remained. The area ruled by the overlord was close to the wildlands and was not a densely populated area. However, due to the existence of the overlord, there were quite a lot of living beings in this place that were extremely close to the overlord. Just the number of living beings in the large area that had been wiped out by the shock wave alone had to be counted in the tens of billions. However, at this moment, apart from a few tens of thousands of cultivators whose strength surpassed the primordial unity pure yang stage, the rest of the living beings were completely wiped out. Although the overlord was willful and egoistic, it did not mean that he was not angry. He was instantly enraged when he was suddenly attacked in such a way that the living beings under him suffered such a great loss. You want to fight? Bring it on. Let me know what makes you, 3,000 cultivators, qualified to stand at the peak of this world. He let out a furious roar, and the aura on his body swelled wildly. The palace, which was still barely maintaining its framework under the protection of his power, instantly collapsed under the impact of this aura, turning into endless dust that swept in all directions. This overlord seemed to be a young man in his 20s. His body was covered in auspicious light, and waves of violent impact were constantly released from his body. They constantly impacted the surrounding space-time and laws of nature, causing the place where he stood to look like a completely chaotic world. At this moment, his eyes shone with an extremely cold light that pierced through all obstacles and shot towards the minor success quasi-sage. It's all because of you. This is why this tribulation has changed. All of you deserve to die. Go to hell. At this moment, the minor success quasi-sage roared. His body drew an incomparably long arc in the air as he charged towards the overlord. Chapter 2366. The overlord naturally showed no mercy to the minor completion quasi-saint who had risked his life to pounce on him. At this moment, his expression turned cold as he unleashed his power. Dazzling light was released from his body and began to entangle the surrounding space-time. The surrounding space-time was connected by the light and turned into countless worlds. Countless worlds piled up around his body and began to spread wildly in all directions as he unleashed his power. At this moment, the surviving subordinates of the overlord began to cry out in alarm and quickly retreated in all directions. However, they did not dare to get close to the overlord's technique. Judging from their anxious expressions, it was as if the overlord was even more terrifying than their greatest enemy. The overlord paid no attention to his subordinates' escape. At this moment, his mind was drowned in anger. All he could see and think of was to wipe out the minor completion quasi-saint who was charging at him. Due to the previous impact, a large area near the Overlord had been completely destroyed and all living things had disappeared. However, this did not mean that there were no living things left in the area controlled by the Overlord. It also did not mean that the minor completion quasi-saint was no longer capable of fighting against this minor completion quasi-saint. At this moment, the aura he exuded was even more powerful than before. The surging aura pushed in all directions like waves, distorting the surrounding space-time and clearing out many areas for the worlds and heavens formed by the combination of light and space-time around him. This process seemed long, but in reality, only a few moments had passed since the minor completion quasi-saint had charged at him and pushed out all of the space-time with his aura. At this moment, even the minor completion quasi-saint had not crossed the distance between them and arrived in front of the Overlord. The Overlord raised his hand and condensed the boundless light he emitted. As the light condensed, the countless worlds and heavens formed by the combination of his light and space-time also condensed. As the light condensed, everything turned into a huge cauldron in front of him. It was an incomparably ancient, incomparably real giant cauldron that looked like it could suppress the heavens and earth. After this giant cauldron was formed, the void froze for a moment, and the space within a radius of tens of thousands of miles was completely suppressed. Even time seemed to have stopped. Boom, 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 boom. Endless explosions rang out from the body of the minor completion quasi-sage, who had been assimilated by the tribulation. Following the explosion, his aura began to swell again. Countless tiny lines frantically spread out from his body, like a spider web that kept expanding, wrapping as much space-time as possible in this web. The appearance of the net had activated the various formations, spells, magic treasures, and powers that already existed in this area, causing various subtle changes to occur in time and space. The state of being suppressed by the giant cauldron began to gradually disappear, and the various characteristics of time and space began to appear again. Ga. The giant cauldron produced a strange sound at this moment. It was as if some kind of power was forcefully crushing the giant cauldron, creating cracks one after another. In the face of such a situation, the Overlord remained unfazed. His body instantly swelled up, and he grabbed the giant cauldron and ruthlessly smashed it towards the minor completion quasi-sage. This smash seemed to be capable of splitting the heavens and earth apart. It seemed like even the chaos would be forcefully smashed apart. Countless spell formations, power, mystiques, power, and even space-time and the laws of natural laws crumbled under the force of the blow. They turned into a strange, hazy gray smoke that followed the cauldron as it closed in on the minor completion quasi-sage. In a flash, the giant cauldron had already arrived in front of the minor completion quasi-sage and slammed into him. After all, the minor completion quasi-sage was a level higher than the Overlord. Although he had lost his cool due to the influence of the baleful aura and the support of the outside world, he still wouldn't be so easily dealt with by a minor completion quasi-sage. The moment the giant cauldron came into contact with his body, an even more terrifying rumble erupted from his body, producing an extremely violent destructive force that poured into the giant cauldron. The giant cauldron began to crumble bit by bit from the point of contact with his body. The giant cauldron was condensed from the power of the Overlord and the surrounding space-time. Compared to magic treasures that had been condensed for countless years, it was still far inferior. In the face of this unimaginably terrifying collision, the cauldron couldn't withstand it and began to crumble at its very core. Countless tiny space-time fragments, nomological law fragments, and endless chaotic energy splashed out from the giant cauldron, causing the already severe chaos in the surroundings to become even more severe. However, the minor completion quasi-sage was in a very bad state. Although he could make the giant cauldron crumble, he wasn't in a good state either. Under the impact of his own power, the impact of the giant cauldron, and the terrifying destructive force released by the collapse of the giant cauldron, the minor completion quasi-sage's body also began to crumble. Moreover, compared to the giant cauldron, his body crumbled even faster. In the end, the minor completion quasi-sage's body completely crumbled with a deafening explosion. It turned into powder that merged with the endless chaos in the surroundings and disappeared without a trace. All that was left was an extremely dense, baleful aura that began to spread in all directions along with the chaos. It combined with the baleful aura that had previously existed in this area and began to corrode all living beings in this area. The most important thing was the Overlord. Get lost! That Overlord let out an angry roar. As he roared, the mark in his body suddenly released an extremely terrifying aura. It directly swept away all the evil aura that had invaded his body, allowing his mind and body to return to a state of clarity. Although the Overlord himself was the embodiment of the tribulations, the nature of his tribulations was different from the tribulations that the world was currently facing. If the power of the tribulations wanted to corrode him, it would first need to fight against the nature of his tribulations and subdue the nature of his tribulations. Only then would it be possible to do so. It was obvious that the Overlord had developed the nature of his tribulations in order to climb to his current position and strength. It was not something that could be easily subdued by this bit of killing intent. After the Overlord cleared away the killing intent from his body and mind, he focused his 3 eyes and looked at the world around him. He began to observe the current situation in this area. It's actually this bad already. What a piece of trash. He couldn't help but curse after seeing the situation clearly. As he cursed, his power surged and boundless light began to be released from his body, suddenly suppressing the vast area of chaos around him. The Overlord's cultivation path was clearly more inclined towards suppression since he was able to combine his power with time and space to form a giant cauldron with powerful suppressive power. Therefore, even though the chaos in the surroundings was so strong that even connate Grand Luo cultivators did not dare to approach, a large area was quickly suppressed by the Overlord's power. All the chaos had completely disappeared. Although the void had not fully recovered and was still in a broken state, at least it was no longer in a state of absolute chaos like before. With just a glance, one could see everything in the surroundings clearly with the naked eye. At this moment, almost 90% of the Overlord's subordinates who were lucky enough to survive had died. It was obvious that only a small portion of the subordinates who had fled as soon as they saw that the situation wasn't right had actually managed to escape. The rest had already been killed by the aftermath of the battle between the two of them. The Overlord did not care about the deaths of his subordinates at all. He merely glanced at them and called them trash. Then, he turned around and soared into the sky, charging towards the depths of the void. His target was the highest palace where the 3,000 cultivators were stationed. To the Overlord, he did not care about what happened to the world or the lives of the living. He only cared about one thing, and that was himself. He did not care about his own interests or his own life. Instead, he cared about his own will. To him, it didn't matter what happened to the world, what happened to the living beings, and even what happened to his own life. As long as his will wasn't carried out, his ego was challenged, and something went against his will, he would definitely use all the means he had to correct this mistake. At this moment, it did not matter to him what happened to the tribulation. Instead, he was more annoyed by the minor achievement sage-to-be who suddenly attacked him. Therefore, after erasing the minor achievement sage-to-be, he went straight to the organization of the minor achievement sage-to-be and the 3,000 cultivators to teach them a lesson and let them know his will. As for the 3,000 cultivators, they were doing their best to help the world survive the tribulation. Their deaths would be a great disaster to the world, and it might even cause the world to collapse, which would lead to his own death, and so on and so forth. All of this had nothing to do with him, as an Overlord. He had naturally interacted with the 3,000 cultivators before. He had also studied the hiding places of the 3,000 cultivators, so he knew where the palace they had been staying in was located in the void. Therefore, he did not need any guidance or calculation at all. He directly broke through the layers of barriers and arrived at the depths of the void where the highest palace was located. He saw the highest palace that seemed to be the center of the universe. The highest palace floated in the depths of the void, emitting an indescribable aura, as if it was connected to everything in the world. It was as if any change in it would cause all sorts of corresponding, huge changes in the world. Looking at the highest palace, the overlord sneered. He raised his hand and grabbed at the void. Boundless light shone from his hand and seeped into the surrounding void. It gathered all the power, all the space-time that could be shaken, and even the nomological laws that could be shaken. It started to condense into a huge cauldron and smashed towards the highest palace. This huge cauldron was about the same size as the minor achievement Sage to Be's huge cauldron. However, it was much weaker in terms of power and suppressive might. After all, the huge cauldron condensed space-time that he had almost complete control over. In that case, under his will, not only did the amount of time and space that were condensed increase, but they were also integrated even more tightly. This time, the huge cauldron was completely different. It was relying on its own will to seize the ownerless power, the ownerless space-time, and the nomological laws. In this way, the quantity of the space-time condensed by the huge cauldron was much lesser than the previous one. Due to the strong resistance against his will, the internal structure of the huge cauldron was not as tight. In this way, there would naturally be a huge difference in the power of the two. However, no matter how big the difference was, the fact that the huge cauldron could take form meant that its power had surpassed a certain lower limit, the lower limit of the attack of a minor achievement Sage to Be. Minor achievement Sage to Be was naturally like an ant to an existence like Luo Fan. However, he was an existence that could be called a saint after all. Even if he was an ant, he was still an ant that was countless times stronger than Khanate Grand Luo Realm cultivators. If an attack of this level was used well, it would not be a problem for it to destroy the world. At this moment, there were many incarnations of cultivators in the highest palace. Although they were much weaker than before in terms of power, they were definitely not weak. However, the 3,000 cultivators would never have expected that there would be a cultivator who disregarded the big picture and directly attacked, intending to destroy the world's greatest hope of overcoming the tribulation. The moment the huge cauldron crashed down, they could not react at all. They could only watch helplessly as the huge cauldron crashed into the palace. Damn it! Who disregards the big picture like this? The cultivators in the huge cauldron could not help but roar in shock and anger. The palace itself had an extremely strong detection effect on the malevolent chi represented by the tribulation. If any malevolent chi approached, it would definitely react. However, the palace did not react to the malevolent chi at all. This clearly showed that the one who attacked the palace was not a cultivator who was affected by the malevolent chi, nor was it a direct malevolent chi attack. Therefore, how could they not know that it was a normal cultivator who was not affected by the malevolent chi? Chapter 2367. When the highest palace was first born, it was already extremely unusual. It possessed unimaginable might and contained almost limitless power. Coupled with the refinement and improvement of the 3,000 cultivators for hundreds of thousands of years, it had long since become an unbelievably powerful magic treasure. The destructive power unleashed by the destruction of such a magic treasure went without saying. At this moment, the void completely collapsed. Boundless shockwaves swept across and completely destroyed the depths of the void, turning everything that had been stable in the surroundings into fragments. Among these fragments, one could see the true world, including the mountains, the earth, the air, the vital energy, and everything else. Through these fragments, one could only vaguely see the unseen world. they could see the faintly discernible and indistinct Great Tao. In the face of this terrifying destructive power, nearly 80% of the avatars of the cultivators in the highest palace could not withstand it at all. As they roared, their avatars collapsed, and they lost control of the region. Only a few were lucky or powerful enough to activate their avatars to protect themselves. Although they were in a precarious situation amidst the boundless destruction, they still managed to stay intact and survive. "It's you?" A mid-tier quasi-sage who saw the overlord shouted with an extremely unsightly expression. Hundreds of overlords had appeared in this world over the past 200,000 years. While this number seemed like a lot, it was nothing compared to the 3,000 cultivators. As long as they had the intention, the faces and auras of the overlords were no secret to them. Clearly, this mid-tier quasi-sage was the kind of person who had the intention. There are still survivors? The overlord sneered at this moment. With this sneer, he raised his hand and grabbed at the air again. The huge cauldron that had collapsed during the collision with the highest palace instantly started to reform. As it did so, it frantically absorbed the countless fragments that had been destroyed by the collapse of the palace and tried its best to fuse them into the huge cauldron. The huge cauldron that he had formed this time was 100 times larger than the original one, and more than 100 times more solid. At this moment, the aura released by the huge cauldron was so strong that it suppressed the chaos in the surroundings and calmed it down slightly. At this moment, the surviving cultivator clones felt an unimaginable pressure crushing down on them from all directions, causing their insides to creak as if their bodies were about to collapse. If these surviving cultivators were only minor sage to be, the situation would have already reached a point of no return. The only thing that awaited them was the possibility of collapse and death. However, it was clear that minor tier sage to be was only a small portion of the surviving cultivators. Almost all the cultivators who survived were mid-tier quasi-sages. As intermediate quasi-sages, they had a two-tier advantage over this overlord. This advantage allowed their strength, might, and even control over their strength and might far surpass the overlords. Just like that, at this moment, when they sensed the terrifying pressure coming from all directions, they started to take action one by one. All sorts of mysterious powers were released from within their bodies, directly breaking through the pressure and allowing them to regain their freedom of movement. However, their struggles clearly added fuel to the chaos in the surroundings. At this moment, terrifying explosions rang out wildly and rushed into the endless chaos in the surroundings, causing it to become even more intense. It seemed to be becoming more and more similar to the state of chaos. At this moment, the Overlord's huge cauldron was like a world of its own, brazenly pressing down on the clones of the 3,000 surviving cultivators. Under this pressure, the chaos seemed to have been completely smoothed out by an invisible hand, maintaining the chaotic stagnation that was impossible under normal circumstances. The moment the chaotic stagnation came into contact with the huge cauldron, it was devoured without reservation and turned into the basic structure of the huge cauldron. It became the cauldron's power, causing the cauldron to become even more powerful and terrifying. Under such circumstances, the huge cauldron collided with the powers released by the survivors. The entire world seemed to have suddenly become quiet at this moment, as if all changes had completely stopped. Soon after, the power of the huge cauldron and the survivors completely collapsed. Along with this collapse, the survivors and the Overlord also collapsed. After all, these survivors were existences that were a few levels higher than the Overlord. Such existences wouldn't lose the ability to resist so easily even if they were in a hurried state. At this moment, the power they released was much weaker than when they were at their peak, but it still surpassed the level that a beginner quasi-saint could reach. In this collision, they easily wiped out the power contained in the huge cauldron. Through the connection of this power, the impact was transmitted to the Overlord's body. Then, through the Overlord's own power, the Overlord's body completely exploded, turning him into powder. Of course, These were only the clones of the cultivators here after all. Their strength was much weaker than their original bodies. How could they withstand this kind of impact that even the original bodies had to use all their strength to deal with? Naturally, they collapsed and were destroyed together with the Overlord under the impact. In the end, they turned into powder and were devoured by the endless chaos in the surroundings, disappearing without a trace. Even though both sides had lost their confrontation, the chaos didn't stop there. On the contrary, due to the loss of the suppression of power and the remnants of the terrifying impact, the chaos became even more terrifying, and the area it covered became even larger. From the perspective of normal spacetime, it looked like a gray haze had suddenly appeared in the sky, as if everything in this universe had been completely shattered and fused together. Moreover, the haze continued to grow and expand as time passed, gradually enveloping a larger and larger area in the gray haze. Indistinctly, a gray haze also appeared out of thin air and poured into the place where the great Tao resided. It began to spread and continuously corrode the place, even affecting the great Tao within. Damn it! These overlords really shouldn't have held back from the beginning. Countless cultivators in various parts of the world simultaneously roared in anger. These were the cultivators who had left their avatars in the highest palace. Clearly, through the transmission of their avatars, they knew everything that had happened in the highest palace, including the cause, process, and outcome. However, these cultivators clearly had good control over their minds. Although they were furious, it wasn't to the extent that they would break through their limits and attract the baleful aura. Why is the chaos getting even more intense after he's dead? At this moment, a trace of doubt flashed across the peak quasi-saint's mind as he was suppressing the tribulations in the small world. The collapse of the highest hall had clearly been completed. Normally speaking, the various chaos that it had created should have gradually calmed down after losing the impetus of the explosion. Eventually, it should have completely disappeared. Why did it seem even more intense and uncontrollable now? Feeling that something was amiss, the peak quasi-saint split off an avatar and soared into the sky, charging towards the chaos in the depths of the void. As a peak quasi-saint, he was in existence close to the pinnacle of this world in every aspect. Although the chaos in the void was terrifying, it wasn't difficult for him to deal with it. Very quickly, he had already crashed into the chaos and started to head towards the depths of the chaos, towards the source of the chaos. Baleful aura? When he was a certain distance away from the source, the peak quasi-saint's avatar couldn't help but exclaim. This was because he sensed a different kind of baleful aura from the outside world appearing in front of him. It was coming from the direction of the source of the chaos. Another tribulation? As this thought appeared in his mind, his expression became extremely unsightly. Different tribulations caused different kinds of baleful aura. In other words, different kinds of baleful aura represented different kinds of tribulations. In this way, there was a kind of baleful aura in the outside world and a kind of baleful aura in the chaos. This clearly meant that two kinds of tribulations had appeared in this world at the same time. How could he calmly accept this fact, which had obviously subverted his understanding of sage to be? What the hell is this world doing? One tribulation is enough to kill us, but now two are coming at the same time. Are you going to throw caution to the wind? The expression of the incarnation of the pinnacle quasi-sage remained unchanged. His body stopped moving forward and began to retreat continuously. Although he wanted to deal with the tribulations and help this world maintain its vitality, it didn't mean that he would throw himself at the tribulations without hesitation. However, this didn't mean that he would risk his life without hesitation when he saw the tribulations. He was duty-bound to face some of the tribulations that he was prepared for, but he wouldn't easily throw away his life for this kind of tribulations that obviously meant that something was wrong with this world. At this moment, the baleful aura that was produced in the depths of the chaos began to expand wildly. In the blink of an eye, it had already infected the entire chaotic region. The chaos in this region was no longer ordinary chaos, but a chaotic, baleful aura. If the peak quasi-saint's avatar hadn't dodged quickly and left the chaotic region before the change occurred, he might have been eroded by the baleful aura and become the carrier of another tribulation. However, the peak quasi-saint was not happy about this. This was because the development of the situation left him in no mood to be happy about it. Just the changes in the previous tribulations were enough to make him run for his life, and he could only see darkness in front of him. Now, a completely different tribulation had appeared, and it was simply like adding hail to snow to the heavens and the earth, causing the already slim hope to grow even dimmer. Looking up at the murky, chaotic region above, the peak quasi-saint seemed to see a figure slowly walking out of it. Judging from the figure's appearance, it was the overlord who had disregarded the overall situation and attacked the palace. Of course, because the figure was still blurry and difficult to see clearly, this was only a guess. Even the peak quasi-saint was not completely sure. At this moment, numerous shooting stars shot out madly from the chaotic area, and they charged swiftly towards every corner of the world. These meteors were so fast that they seemed to surpass the speed of time. In the blink of an eye, it had covered the entire sky. No matter how many light years away it was from the chaotic region, everyone could clearly see the meteors streaking across their heads. They're spreading? The peak quasi-sage was shocked. His body gave off boundless light and boundless might as he charged towards the meteors. He clashed with them and did his best to destroy them. However, it was a pity that only a few of these powers and brilliances had any effect. Most of the rays of light and power couldn't even shake the meteors, allowing them to continue their original trajectory and head towards their destination without being affected at all. They crashed into the ground and exploded, producing boundless baleful chi that spread in all directions and started to infect the surrounding areas. Most areas already had baleful chi, so the addition of the new baleful chi didn't cause any conflict. Instead, the two kinds of baleful chi complemented each other and even fused indescribably under certain special circumstances, giving birth to a third kind of baleful chi that was different from the two kinds of baleful chi, yet contained the characteristics of the two kinds of baleful chi. Is this the end of the world? At this moment, the overlords all over the world, in other words, the incarnations of the predestined tribulations, suddenly felt an extremely subtle and mysterious sensation from the bottom of their hearts. They murmured almost at the same time. As they murmured, the power in their bodies began to rebel involuntarily. The aura of the predestined tribulations that was buried deep in their life imprints began to expand involuntarily. Chapter 2368. All sorts of indescribable and strange emotions were born in the hearts of the many overlords. Amidst these emotions, their already faint feelings for the world faded even further. Instead, they were replaced by indescribable impulses. The impulses to destroy the world in all sorts of ways. For these overlords, it was impossible for them to suppress themselves. Thus, the moment these impulses appeared, they took action. Boundless power and power were released from their bodies, and they began to wreak all sorts of destruction on the region they ruled over, on the entire world. Space-time was thrown into chaos, yin and yang were overturned, laws were reconstructed, living beings were modified, the ground turned into magma, and the air turned into poisonous fog. There was only unimaginable destruction, not destruction that didn't exist. As they destroyed, all sorts of baleful auras that were already flowing out began to surge, causing more and more living beings to be corroded by them. The depth of the corrosion grew deeper and deeper. Gradually, the various baleful auras began to come into contact with one another and fuse with each other, gradually producing all sorts of unimaginable changes. They sublimated into a baleful aura that was more terrifying than any baleful aura that any cultivator had ever seen in this world apart from Luo Fan. Due to this baleful aura, the destruction that the world suffered was no longer just on the surface. Instead, it began to penetrate the depths of the world, into the unseen world, and into the great Tao within it. The entire world began to tremble indescribably, as if an invisible force was grabbing hold of the world and shaking it violently. Vaguely, at the highest point in the sky, beyond the ends of the world, and even at the bottom of the abyss in the depths of the wildlands in the southwest, all sorts of strange tremors were becoming more and more obvious. It was as if some kind of incomparably terrifying thing was constantly approaching this world from all directions, and was currently invading this world through the ends of the world. The great Tao in the unseen world began to struggle violently at this moment. Endless power was released from it and began to descend upon the world in a frenzy. It swept through every corner of the world, trying its best to stabilize the extremely weak laws and protect the collapsing space-time. Vaguely, there seemed to be a strange vortex forming in the void. It's finally appeared. At this moment, somewhere in the world that was extremely calm, Luo Fan raised his head, and this thought flashed through his mind. For all the other cultivators in the world, they couldn't detect the vortex in the sky at all. However, to him, the vortex couldn't be more obvious. Moreover, not only did he see the vortex, he also clearly knew what it was. That vortex was none other than the incarnation of the will of the world. At this moment, an incomparably powerful and majestic aura was faintly discernible within the vortex. Even though it was only a sliver, it had already spread throughout the entire world and deeply affected all the laws of the world, space, and even the Grand Tao. The will of the world was not an emotionless machine. It also had intelligence, emotions, and everything that an intelligent being should have. However, due to the difference in levels, all of this was incomprehensible to normal living beings. Even Luo Fan was completely baffled by the will of the world. He couldn't understand it at all. After the baleful auras released by the incarnations of the tribulations fused with each other, they seemed to produce an indescribable suction force that drew in something beyond the world. As more and more of them fused and became more and more harmonious, the suction force towards something beyond the world grew stronger. The commotion caused by the thing that was approaching the world from all directions became more and more obvious. In the end, the moment the baleful auras fused past a certain boundary, the entire world began to shake violently. At the ends of the world, it was as if huge cracks had suddenly been torn open, allowing the things that were originally approaching to rush in through these cracks, and began to spread endlessly throughout the world. The thing that was charging in from all directions was none other than the infinitely terrifying baleful auras. This baleful aura was more powerful and terrifying than any baleful aura that any living being had seen in the world apart from Luo Fan. Even the baleful aura formed from the fusion of the incarnations of the tribulations paled in comparison. After this boundlessly terrifying baleful aura descended, it instantly spread to the entire world, causing the entire world to be covered in a layer of strange mist. Within the mist, the baleful aura that originally existed in the world began to be corroded by the mist, and its nature began to change to that of the mist. At this moment, in the abyss of the southwestern wildlands, the leader of the alliance roared, "Our chance has arrived." With this roar, he charged out of the abyss without any hesitation. In the blink of an eye, he had rushed out of the abyss and began to freely stretch his body, which had been suppressed for hundreds of thousands of years, in the outside world. As he roared and moved, the other living beings reacted at the same time. They followed behind him with great fanaticism and charged out of the abyss as well, beginning to stretch their bodies in the world. At this moment, the boundless black mist that filled the sky and the earth began to rapidly gather towards these creatures. It began to drill into their bodies and seep into their life imprint. As the black mist seeped in, the life imprints of these living beings began to swell wildly. There were already quite a number of chaotic creatures, and their auras began to grow stronger. In the span of a few breaths, these living beings exploded into countless fragments. However, this wasn't the end. This was just the beginning. Next, the fragments began to gather once more. As they gathered, the aura of a chaotic creature began to grow stronger and stronger. Finally, after a few more breaths, all the fragments gathered back into one and turned into living beings. However, the newly formed creature no longer looked like its original form. Judging from their appearances, they had completely changed into the appearance of the chaotic creatures that had descended from the chaotic state back then. Moreover, not only had their appearances changed drastically, but their strength had also become many times stronger than before. At this moment, even the weakest living being among the tens of thousands of living beings was slightly stronger than a beginner-stage quasi-saint. The strongest among them had even broken through the shackles of the peak quasi-saint realm and stepped into the pseudo-saint realm. Moreover, they weren't ordinary pseudo-saints in the first or second stage, but pseudo-saints in the 9th stage. At this moment, these living beings let out loud roars and began to release their terrifying strength joyfully. They began to wreak all sorts of destruction in this world. To all living beings and everything in this world, the black mist that filled the void was the most vicious poisonous gas that could destroy everything. However, to these living beings, the black mist was the source of their strength. Enveloped by the mist, no matter how much they consumed, they could be replenished in an instant. Their strength was almost endless and would never be cut off. Moreover, apart from constantly replenishing their strength, as the black mist became thicker, they even began to absorb more and more nutrients from the mist. Their strength was also strengthened again and again through this absorption. Just like at this moment, in less than a dozen breaths, these living beings had generally leveled up by one level. Moreover, unlike the living beings that were eroded by the black mist, the consciousness of these living beings that emitted the aura of chaotic creatures was still extremely complete. They weren't deceived by the black mist. Their eyes were still clear and bright. Evidently, the black mist didn't interfere with their consciousness. The appearance of these living beings was like adding snow to the world. This world, that was already on the brink of collapse, took another big step towards the abyss of collapse. The second catastrophe of the world has finally arrived. Let me see how long you can hold out. At this moment, Luo Fan looked up at the vortex in the sky that was getting more and more obvious as he murmured. The moment the boundless murderous aura was drawn in from beyond the world, he knew that his original plan had succeeded. The second great tribulation of heaven and earth, which was supposed to descend 200 to 300 million years later, had finally arrived 200 to 300 million years earlier under his various schemes. To the world, this early arrival was equivalent to launching an attack when it wasn't prepared for it. It went without saying that the impact it received was much greater than when it was prepared. It could be said that the early arrival of the Second Great Tribulation was already a huge crisis for the world. From the various chaos that appeared in this world at this moment, it could be seen how obvious the effects of Luo Fan's plan this time were. However, for this part of the world, the early arrival of the Second Great Tribulation of the heavens and earth was something that could not be worse. It was also not a good thing for the catastrophe of the world. One had to know that the catastrophe of the world also needed to be brewed and prepared. Normally speaking, when this world developed to a certain level, it would naturally emit a mysterious aura that entered the world. At that time, the great tribulation of the world would naturally be triggered, and the power of the tribulation would naturally pour into this world, imposing a test on this world. In that case, the intensity of the catastrophe of the world would only be determined by the level of development of this world. The energy consumption of the catastrophe itself would also be limited. Even if it failed, the loss would only be the power that poured into this world. However, the situation at this moment was clearly not like this. Normally speaking, this was still not the time for this world to encounter the second catastrophe of the world. In other words, while the world was not ready to face the catastrophe of the world was not ready to impose a test on this world either. As a result, if the catastrophe of the world wanted to descend on this world, it would not be able to pour a portion of its power into this world like normal. Instead, it would have to pour the foundation of the catastrophe of the world into this world at the same time. Only then would there be enough power to activate the test of this world. In this way, once this world survived this catastrophe of the world, the foundation of the catastrophe of the world would also be destroyed. From now on, no matter how much this world developed, it would no longer be able to trigger the catastrophe of the world to descend. Perhaps some people would think that this was a good thing, but in reality, this was a situation that could not be any worse for this world. The existence of the catastrophe of the world was undoubtedly a sharp sword hanging over a world's head, but it also represented an opportunity for improvement. Once a world finally survived 9 catastrophe of the world, it would be sublimated from a perfect world to a great world without catastrophe. Under such circumstances, if a perfect world lost the catastrophe of the world, it would obviously lose the opportunity to sublimate and the hope of growing into a great world. This was simply equivalent to castrating a world. How could this be considered a good thing? At this moment, Luo Fan was in a very ordinary place in this world. Before the catastrophe, there were no living creatures here, and no cultivators could discover the uniqueness of this place. However, when the catastrophe of the world descended and boundless evil chi filled the world, the uniqueness of this place was completely highlighted. This was because, in contrast to many other places in this world that were drowned in evil chi, this place was completely untouched by any evil chi. Within a radius of tens of thousands of kilometers where he lived, the world was clear. It looked exactly the same as before the catastrophe, and there was not a trace of abnormality at all. Even ordinary living creatures could clearly sense the uniqueness of this place in such a strange situation, let alone the many cultivators with extraordinary strength. At this moment, many gazes were directed at the area where Luo Fan was from all directions. What's there? Why would it reject such a tribulation of heaven and earth? Voices of doubt resounded among the cultivators who still had some sanity. Chapter 2369. Luo Fan did not care at all when he saw the many rays of light approaching him. He did not try to block their senses like he did in the past. Instead, he quietly watched as they got closer and finally appeared in the sky above this area. Because Luo Fan no longer hid his existence, those creatures could all see the place where Luo Fan was living in seclusion in this area at this moment. His place of seclusion was just a very ordinary thatched hut. It was located among the mountains and seemed to be perfectly integrated with the entire mountain range. Among the many cultivators who came to this area, the weakest one was a sage-to-be, while the strongest one was about to reach the false sage realm. However, the instant they saw the thatched hut, they were all shocked beyond imagination. In a trance, they seemed to have crossed all obstacles and seen the great Tao in the dark. They saw the source of cultivation and the source of techniques. For a moment, many cultivators stood there in a daze. Various rays of enlightenment flickered in their eyes. Some cultivators who were on the verge of breaking through and were just short of an opportunity broke through the bottleneck and broke through to the next realm. Among these cultivators who broke through, the strongest among the 3,000 cultivators, the peak sage-to-be who was about to reach the false sage realm was one of them. At this moment, the peak sage-to-be could no longer suppress his aura and began to expand crazily. The power in his body seemed to have turned into a surging sea, producing a deafening roar. Wave after wave of strange impacts spread out from his body in all directions. At this moment, a strange auspicious cloud appeared out of nowhere above his head. From the auspicious clouds, one after another could be seen being born, destroyed, born again, and destroyed again. Crack! There seemed to be a cracking sound coming from within the peak sage-to-be's body. As the cracking sound appeared, the peak sage-to-be's aura underwent a sudden qualitative change. He broke through the limit of the peak sage-to-be and entered the false sage realm. Along with this aura was his life essence, his spirit, his power, his body, and everything else. In just a few breaths, He had achieved the breakthrough that he had been looking forward to for hundreds of thousands of years. He had broken through the shackles of the sage-to-be and become a false saint. This improvement seemed to be just a small breakthrough, but it had already reached an unimaginable level for his essence. As a result, his strength had increased by more than 100 times compared to before. Similar to the breakthrough obtained by this pseudo-sage cultivator, the other cultivators more or less also obtained some improvement. An inexplicable excitement began to linger among the cultivators. The feeling of despair brought about by the early arrival of the great tribulation of heaven and earth had weakened a lot. Seeing the changes in these cultivators, Luo Fan only smiled faintly. He was not surprised at all. After all, after the tribulation had changed from an ordinary tribulation to a great tribulation of heaven and earth, the world obviously could not treat ordinary tribulations as it used to. It could not allow the living beings and cultivators in this world to struggle and resist the various threats of the tribulation. It had to break away from its original high and mighty way of treatment and directly participate in this tribulation. It had to use all its means to help the living beings in this world who wanted to resist the tribulation to obtain the power to resist it. Obviously, directly improving the strength of the cultivators and strengthening their cultivation realm was the most effective way. In other words, besides the various profundities contained within the thatched cottage that Luo Fan constructed, the reason those numerous cultivators were able to obtain such breakthroughs and improvements was more importantly because of the blessing provided to them by the heavens and the earth. If they still could not achieve a breakthrough with such an advantage, it would be a waste of the world's hope on them. For Luo Fan, this was a fact that was obvious at a glance, but for the many cultivators, it was clearly a secret that they could not understand. At this moment, they could only attribute the root cause of their improvement and breakthrough to the thatched hut hidden in the mountains. In other words, it was all thanks to Luo Fan who built the thatched hut. At this moment, with a flash, they quickly arrived in front of the thatched hut and directly landed. Although the root cause of their breakthrough was more because of the blessing of this world, they had to admit that the mysteries contained in Luo Fan's thatched hut also had a certain effect. Even though the initial shock had passed, when these cultivators approached the thatched hut, they were still incomparably shocked by the countless mysteries contained within it. Each and every one of them looked at the thatched hut with incomparable reverence. They looked up at Luo Fan, who was quietly sitting at the wooden table in front of the thatched hut, sipping his tea. Teacher of the origin of the method. The pseudo-sage cultivator was experienced and knowledgeable after all, and he still remembered Luo Fan who had once preached Tao. The moment he saw Luo Fan, he could not help but kneel. At this moment, countless thoughts flashed through his mind, and countless problems that were originally completely unsolvable became so clear and easy to solve. Why could this area remain calm during the great calamity of the world? Why could a carelessly built thatched hut lead to so many people's breakthroughs? Why could he find this area and this person in front of him at this moment? Everything became so clear at this moment. In the end, all of his emotions converged into anticipation. Teacher of the origin of the method, please save this world. Save all living beings. The pseudo-sage cultivator who had just broken through begged Luo Fan directly at this moment. Hearing this, the others seemed to have woken up from a dream. Although not all of them had seen Luo Fan before, all of them had heard of the legends about Luo Fan, and they knew that when the world was first formed, there was an extraordinary person called the origin of the method in this world. This extraordinary person was extremely powerful, and it seemed that he could destroy the world by himself. Moreover, the cultivation system that was currently being spread in this world was also spread by this strange person. Every time they were in despair, they would hope that this extraordinary person was real, and they would hope that he would come out and save them from this desperate situation. Unfortunately, their hopes had been dashed all this time. Time and time again, he failed to catch it, it was precisely because they had failed time and time again that they had unknowingly started to feel more and more doubtful about the existence of such an extraordinary person. However, they did not expect this extraordinary person to appear again when the world encountered a terrifying calamity that was tens of thousands of times more powerful than usual. He displayed his power to them without holding anything back. This naturally made them come up with an inexplicable guess. Perhaps the calamities in the past were not dangerous to this world at all, which was why this extraordinary person did not make a move. Now that this calamity had truly threatened the survival of this world and affected the survival of all living beings, he would only appear again and make a move again. At that moment, the other cultivators also knelt before Luo Fan and begged their teacher, the origin of the method, to save the world. In response to their pleas, Luo Fan only smiled and said, "Although all of you are sincere, it's a pity that I have something that I can't tell you, so I can't make a move." Hearing that, many of the cultivators revealed looks of shock. Some of them even revealed looks of despair. At that moment, they continued to plead one by one, begging Luo Fan to be merciful. For the sake of all living beings in this world, he would overcome all difficulties and help this world. Luo Fan smiled faintly and said, "Although I can't make a move directly, I can still do my part for this world." The cultivators were all shocked by what they saw. If he could not make a move directly, how could he do his part for this world? Could it be that this teacher, the origin of the method, was tricking them? Luo Fan did not care about the changes in their expressions. After speaking, he raised his hand and pointed. Thousands of spiritual lights charged out from his hand toward the heads of the cultivators. Before the cultivators could react, the spiritual lights rushed into their heads and fused into their souls, becoming their memories. At that instant, the cultivators felt boundless information erupt from the depths of their souls. In the blink of an eye, they understood countless secrets that they did not know before and understood countless truths that they could not understand before. Even their cultivation realm began to expand and improve during this process. The cultivator who had just become a pseudo-holiness even broke through the shackles of the first-rank pseudo-holiness and stepped into the second-rank pseudo-holiness. Just the influx of this information had already broken through a realm. Once they carefully studied the truths within the information, just thinking about how much progress they would make, many cultivators could not help but smile. However, they quickly regained their wits and realized how terrible the situation was. Their expressions returned to being solemn once again. The second-rank pseudo-holiness sighed and said to Luo Fan in distress, "Although teacher has good intentions, we don't have time to cultivate at all." Hearing this, Luo Fan smiled and said, "Don't worry, if it was any other time, you would naturally need time to improve. But it is different now. In this situation, you only need to fight, and you will be able to improve and break through at every moment." His words naturally could not convince those cultivators. One by one, the cultivators looked at Luo Fan with inexplicable eyes, seemingly wanting to see if Luo Fan was joking. Luo Fan naturally did not care about this. With a slight smile, he said, Go. You will know very soon. Right now, all of you are not isolated and without help. The entire world is your greatest reinforcement. Once things go wrong, you can communicate with the world, and you will naturally be able to get guidance." As he spoke, he waved his hand, and all the cultivators felt their vision become blurry. When they recovered, they were back in the area enveloped by the boundless baleful aura. Whether it was the calm area that rejected the baleful aura of the great tribulation of the heavens and earth, or the teacher of the origin of the technique, they had all disappeared, as if they had never been there in the first place. Teacher of the origin of the technique? Teacher of the origin of the technique? The cultivators stood up and shouted. They spread their senses in all directions, and some even flew into the sky to observe their surroundings with their naked eyes. However, no matter how hard they tried, in the end, they could only see the world shrouded by the boundless killing intent. They could not see the peaceful place where they had stayed for a long time, nor could they see the thatched hut of the teacher of the origin of the technique. Everything that had happened before felt like a dream. The current situation clearly did not allow them to search for too long. The changes in the surrounding space-time and the corrosion of the killing intent made them give up on their search soon after, and they began to wholeheartedly resist the disaster of the world. The boundless killing intent was only the appearance of the arrival of the disaster. The true manifestation of the disaster was the various forces, objects, living beings, and laws that were affected by the disaster. This was also the fundamental reason why, although there was only one type of killing intent in the disaster, it was divided into waves. Each wave had its own unique characteristics, and each wave was different from the others. The cultivators very quickly sensed the terror of the disaster of the world. They were brazenly sent away by the boundless flames brought by the disaster. One by one, they were sent to different parts of the world, and the connection between them was completely severed by the extremely strange flames. Under such circumstances, the various dependence and expectations that they had developed before naturally disappeared. Instead, they could only rely on themselves and stimulate all their potential to resist the disaster. After all, they had already improved. Compared to the beginning, their performance this time was much better. Although they stumbled under the corrosion of the tribulations, they still managed to withstand the flames and survive this wave of tribulations. However, the disaster of the world was clearly not something that could be ended by a single wave of disaster. Even the first disaster of the world had taken so many years. The second disaster of the world was much more dangerous than the first, so how could they survive it so easily? Come on, even without the help of the teacher of the origin of the technique, I can still save the world. The second stage pseudo-sage cultivator let out a furious roar and broke through the pitch-black clouds in the sky. He rushed into the sea of lightning above the clouds and directly resisted the second wave of disaster. Chapter 2370. After becoming a Rank 2 pseudo-saint, the Alliance Master's strength had increased by hundreds of times compared to before. He charged into the sea of lightning brazenly, and the sea of lightning was instantly triggered. Boundless power began to rush towards him from all directions, colliding with the power he released, causing the entire world to shake violently. At this moment, the vortex that was the carrier of the will of the world slowly rotated high up in the sky. All sorts of emotions that ordinary living beings could not understand constantly spread out from the vortex, vaguely affecting the entire world. It affected all living beings, all power, all laws, and even time and space. As this change occurred, the countless living beings that were not affected by the fiendish chi of the great tribulation of the world felt countless rays of inspiration flickering in the depths of their hearts. They discovered that the various factors that were restricting their cultivation seemed to have become much weaker. It was as if as long as they wanted to, they could easily comprehend the mysteries that would allow them to break through. Even their cultivation continued to improve at a visible rate. The Alliance Master, who was already a Rank 2 pseudo-saint, felt the same. At this moment, he was facing the wave of the great tribulation of the world alone. The pressure he endured was enough to make any pseudo-saint feel fear. With such a terrifying pressure acting on the pseudo-sage, it went without saying that the impact on him was huge. In that instant, the pseudo-saint felt like he was walking on the edge of life and death at every moment. The pressure caused countless rays of inspiration to burst out from the depths of his heart at all times. The mysteries that Luo Fan had taught him before began to surface at this moment, and they were converted into his comprehension at an unimaginable rate. In the end, his cultivation began to rise continuously. In the end, after spending more than 10 days, he finally managed to withstand the endless attacks of the boundless Thunder Sea. The second stage pseudo-sage had already broken through to the third stage pseudo-sage. Of course, even though he had obtained such a breakthrough, he was still in such a sorry state. His body had already been completely shattered, and he looked like a human silhouette formed from countless grains of sand. If it wasn't for the fact that he was a powerful cultivator, but a normal living being, he would have died a long time ago in such a state. However, this kind of if obviously did not happen. In the end, he was still a powerful cultivator. Although he was in a sorry state, his life was not in danger. Not long after, the countless fragments began to fuse back together, allowing him to recover in the blink of an eye. His body looked complete again, no longer in a sorry state. It really is the tribulation of the heavens and earth. Feeling the huge improvement in his body compared to a few days ago, the pseudo-saint smiled bitterly. He had the experience of the previous Great Tribulation, and he knew that it would only be so easy to break through during the Great Tribulation. If it wasn't for the Great Tribulation of the world, even if he had so many inspirations and comprehended so many principles of cultivation, he would only be able to make visible improvements at most. It would be impossible for him to directly break through to the next realm. Although he had painstakingly helped this world survive a tribulation, this was clearly not the end. In fact, what he had just endured was only a small part of the tribulation that this world had encountered. In other places that he couldn't reach, the attacks from the Great Tribulation of the world had completely changed the situation of the world. It made the entire world seem like it had fallen into an abyss of water and fire. Everything seemed to have fallen into a countdown to destruction. Moreover, the boundless ominous aura was still gathering above him, transforming and brewing. It was obvious that another wave of tribulation would be triggered at any time. Facing such a scene, the pseudo-saint clearly could not think too much about his own situation. Soon, he could only devote all his attention to the great tribulation of the heavens and earth, as well as the new attacks and destruction that this world might encounter, while all living beings in this world were struggling to help this world survive the second great tribulation of the heavens and earth. Duan Shi, who was cultivating in seclusion, suddenly sensed something and slowly opened his eyes that had been closed for hundreds of thousands of years. What's going on? There seems to be a drastic change in this world. What's going on? He murmured. His eyes flickered as he spread his perception to the outside world. He was now in despair. In this world, he was only weaker than Luo Fan. Compared to the most powerful cultivators in this world, he was tens of thousands of times stronger. Under such circumstances, he had only used his perception to scan the surroundings slightly, but he was already able to clearly see the situation of the entire world. His expression changed drastically in an instant, and he could not help but stand up. Great tribulation of the heavens and earth. How can it be a great tribulation of the heavens and earth? According to my calculations, the great tribulation of the heavens and earth will only come in 200 to 300 million years. Why is it happening now? His complexion was incomparably unsightly. His figure flashed, and directly rushed out of his palace. He crossed the infinite obstacles, and directly arrived in the normal spacetime, appearing at the location where Luo Fan's body had originally been. At this time, that place had already fallen into endless destruction. Even the normal state of spacetime could not be maintained. It was extremely chaotic, as if all the factors had been mixed in a strange scene. The first great tribulation of the heavens and earth was under the command of his predecessor. Although he had completely lost the memory of his predecessor, such a terrifying tribulation would still leave a mark in his heart. At this moment, in this chaos, the mark hidden in the bottom of his heart was instantly stimulated, and he suddenly understood what he should do. With a slight thought, he casually swept his hand, and the boundless great tribulation of the heavens and earth around him was suddenly swept away. As the great tribulation of the heavens and earth was swept away, the endless chaos in the surroundings was completely suppressed at the same time. Although the surroundings did not completely return to their original appearance, it was no longer a scene that looked like the end of the world. However, although he was already in despair, and had extremely powerful supernatural powers. Compared to the second great tribulation of the heavens and earth, it was still insignificant. Therefore, at this time, the great tribulation of the heavens and earth that was swept away by him only covered an area of hundreds of thousands of miles. Outside this area, the ominous aura of the great tribulation of heaven and earth was still surging. It was even constantly suppressing his power, trying to invade the areas that he had cleaned up and plunge this area into absolute chaos once again. Faced with such a situation, Duan Shi's expression became extremely ugly. It really is the second great tribulation of the heavens and earth. What's the reason for this? With this thought in mind, a figure suddenly flashed in the depths of his heart. It was a supreme existence that sat in the center of the universe as if the entire universe was revolving around him. All the mysteries of the heavens and earth in the universe originated from him. Luo Fan. However, based on his understanding of the heavens and earth, it seemed that only his supreme teacher could do this and trigger the great tribulation of the heavens and earth in advance, which was supposed to arrive in another 200 to 300 million years. With this realization, he released his perception and began to probe in all directions. In the blink of an eye, he found an extremely calm area that was tens of thousands of light years away from here. His relationship with Luo Fan was much closer than any other living being in this world. At this moment, he found traces of Luo Fan in this area. At this moment, how could he not know that Luo Fan was there? With a slight thought, he turned into a ray of light and soared into the sky. In the blink of an eye, he crossed tens of thousands of light years and came to this extremely ordinary-looking mountain range. He directly found the thatched hut that seemed to have completely integrated with the mountains. Although he was already in despair, the gap between him and Luo Fan was still extremely huge. The feeling he got when he saw the thatched hut at this time was similar to the feeling many cultivators had when they saw the thatched hut before. He also felt an unimaginable shock, as if the root of cultivation was directly placed in front of him. It made him comprehend many mysteries that he had never imagined before in a trance. Many vague inspirations appeared in his heart, making him feel like he was about to grasp some kind of clue for a breakthrough. However, he was still a desperate person after all. It was obviously not that easy to break through and become a supreme emperor. If it was really that simple, this realm would not be called a desperate person. Therefore, although he had obtained some clues and felt like he was about to grasp some kind of opportunity for a breakthrough, he did not achieve a breakthrough in the end. In the end, after a slight fluctuation in his realm, it stabilized again. As expected, you've still been alarmed. At this time, a leisurely sigh entered Duan Shi's ears. Hearing the voice, Duan Shi felt an indescribable sense of familiarity in his heart. An inexplicable sense of respect and admiration made his originally cold expression involuntarily become calm again. The voice was obviously the voice of his teacher, in other words, Luo Fan's voice. With a flicker of his eyes, he noticed Luo Fan, who was sitting at the wooden table in front of the thatched hut and sipping tea. In an instant, the anxiety, doubt, and even faint anger that was originally present had completely disappeared. In a flash, his figure directly appeared in front of Luo Fan and directly knelt to greet him. "Disciple greets teacher," he said obediently as he bowed. Luo Fan only smiled and said, "Get up. I can see that you seem to have a lot of doubts in your heart, right?" Hearing this, Duan Shi nodded and said, "Indeed, I do have a lot of doubts in my heart." "For example?" Luo Fan said with a smile. Duan Shi stood up, gritted his teeth and said, "For example, is the second great calamity of heaven and earth triggered by teacher in advance? You can say that, but you can also say that it's not." Luo Fan still smiled and said in a rather leisurely manner. As he spoke, he took another sip of the fragrant tea. He only felt that his mouth was salivating and his entire body was soaked by a warm current. With a slight thought, he waved his hand and another teacup appeared in front of him. The teapot took the initiative to step forward and poured fragrant tea into the teacup. After that, he said, "Come, drink a cup of tea to calm down first." Hearing this, Duan Shi was stunned. Although he was anxious to speak, he still listened to Luo Fan's arrangement. He took the teacup and drank the tea in one gulp. Compared to Luo Fan, who only felt that his body was being soaked by the warm current, Duan Shi's reaction was much stronger. At that moment, he felt the power in his body surging wildly. Endless mysteries were produced out of nowhere and were continuously injected into his soul. Among his power, he could vaguely feel that his cultivation level was rising at a crazy rate. It was as if he had come into contact with a realm that he had always dreamed of. After a long while, he finally recovered from the state of crazy improvement. After sensing it slightly, he could not help but be shocked. Compared to before he drank this cup of tea, his current cultivation realm had increased by several times. Although he had not broken through the despair realm, he was still not a supreme emperor realm. However, the extent of the improvement was beyond his wildest dreams. "Thank you, teacher." Duan Shi immediately expressed his gratitude. Luo Fan still smiled and said, "Have you calmed down now?" Duan Shi was stunned for a moment, then nodded and said, "Indeed, I have calmed down." At that moment, he was much more clear-headed than before. It was as if the dark clouds that originally shrouded over his head had completely dispersed. The urgent feeling that had been urging him in the bottom of his heart had completely disappeared. At that moment, he felt like he had returned to the state when he was listening to Luo Fan's lecture. Everything in the outside world seemed to have no meaning to him anymore. With this change, his thoughts became many times more active than before. His original idea of questioning Luo Fan had disappeared without a trace under this kind of clear thinking, and it was replaced by a kind of lingering fear. "Just now, was it heaven and earth that affected me?" he asked with some difficulty. Luo Fan nodded and said, "Of course. No matter what, you were created by heaven and earth, so you are naturally treated as a part of heaven and earth. Now that heaven and earth have encountered a great disaster, they naturally need to gather all the power that they can. How can you be an exception?" Duan Shi's expression became inexplicably ugly. That was the reason. If it happened to someone else, he would be happy to see it happen. However, it was not so easy for him to accept this kind of thing happening to him. After all, although he was born in heaven and earth, and could be considered as a creature created by heaven and earth, he had responsibilities and obligations to heaven and earth. After all, he was no longer the simple power that he was before he was born. Now, he had an independent will. Chapter 23:71. Thank you, Master. If it weren't for you, I wouldn't even know I was turned into a puppet. Duan Shi immediately knelt down at Luo Fan and thanked him. Hearing this, Luo Fan just smiled and said, "Being able to wake up proves that your cultivation these days has been fruitful." Duan Shi's eyes lit up. He was about to express his humility. However, Luo Fan spoke again. "However, don't be careless. Just because you're awake now doesn't mean you'll always be awake. Heaven and earth won't give up so easily. If you let your guard down, you'll fall into the trap immediately." Duan Shi could not help but shiver. He quickly responded. Luo Fan encouraged him again. A while later, Duan Shi recalled the previous topic and asked, "Master, you mentioned that the calamity of heaven and earth can be considered as your doing, but it can also be ignored. Why is that?" Even though heaven and earth could set him up at any time and affect his emotions and willpower, it did not mean that Duan Shi had completely changed his attitude toward heaven and earth. His love for heaven and earth had turned into hatred. As a matter of fact, he still had deep feelings for heaven and earth at that moment. He couldn't bear to watch the destruction of this world. Luo Fan smiled and said, "I'm the one who triggered the calamity of heaven and earth, but I'm not the one who controlled it. In the end, it had developed to this stage because of the combination of many factors. In other words, it's the choice of heaven and earth, and the calamity of heaven and earth. Duan Shi was stunned when he heard that. He had originally guessed that Luo Fan would have a variety of answers. He had even thought of all kinds of strange and absurd answers, but he hadn't expected that Luo Fan's answer would actually be such a sophistry. Since Master is the one who triggered the calamity of heaven and earth, doesn't that mean Master is the root of everything? How could he describe it with yes and no? Teacher. At that moment, he said hesitantly. What kind of person was Luo Fan? Naturally, he could tell what he was thinking. He shook his head and laughed. It's not what you think. What I'm doing is merely triggering the various imprints that originally existed in this world. Just like how I helped you escape from the true divine's control. After that, I didn't interfere or influence what the existence I was helping chose at every fork in the road. In the end, it developed to this stage completely because of their interaction with the world. Upon hearing this, Duan Shi came to a sudden realization. He could not help but show a guilty expression on his face. As for Luo Fan, he trusted him very much. Since Luo Fan had already said so, it meant that this was the case. There was no other possibility. This made him feel guilty for suspecting whether Luo Fan was deceiving him. I've really gone too far. Teacher treats me so well, yet I still suspect him. This was the thought that appeared in his heart at this moment. In the midst of these thoughts, he suddenly had a flash of inspiration. He came to his senses and said, So, Teacher won't stop me from helping this world to overcome this calamity of heaven and earth? Luo Fan smiled and nodded. He said, Of course. It's up to you to make your choice. I'm just confirming whether your choice is from your heart and from your true will. Duan Shi's eyes were filled with gratitude. He bowed to Luo Fan and said, Thank you, teacher. I'll always remember your kindness. Hearing this, how could Luo Fan not understand his choice? At that moment, he just smiled and nodded, but no longer spoke. When Duan Shi saw that Luo Fan had nothing else to say, he didn't stay any longer. He saluted once more and turned into a ray of light, rushing out of this calm area and disappearing into the boundless evil qi in the surroundings. After all, he's a native creature of this world. No matter how dissatisfied he is with this world, he's still willing to sacrifice his life for it. Luo Fan could not help but sigh inexplicably as he watched Duan Shi's back disappear into the distance. However, it was just a sigh. After that, he withdrew his gaze from Duan Shi and all the creatures in this world. He turned to look at the vortex that was materialized by the world's will in the void. The vortex floated in the deepest part of the void. It looked like a huge eye that was staring at everything that was happening in this world. Compared to the few times it had appeared in the past, the will of the world was much clearer this time. Furthermore, it did not show any signs of disappearing right after it appeared. Instead, it was like an extra sun or moon had appeared in the world, quietly hanging in the depths of the void. Everything that happened in the world, be it what ordinary living beings could or could not sense, was reflected in the depths of the vortex, causing all sorts of complicated and profound reactions. Luo Fan was not like the other cultivators in this world. His level was much higher than the other cultivators. At this moment, he did not just sense the various things happening in the real world. The scenes in the other worlds flashed past his heart at the same time. At this moment, he could clearly sense that the existences corresponding to the world's will were also materialized in the other worlds. Moreover, compared to the obscurity of reality, in the vast majority of other dimensions, the vortex that manifested from the will of the world did not conceal what it was doing at all. It directly displayed everything in front of Luo Fan, who could see everything. The vortex that was materialized by the world's will was connected to everything in this world, in almost every world. Even the cultivators and creatures in it could not break free from the connection. Even Luo Fan was vaguely affected by the world's will at this moment. The world's will was also looking for various ways to bring him into the world's system. In other words, it wanted to use his power to help the world resist the world's calamity. However, it was a pity that at this time, Luo Fan could clearly see all of its methods and clearly feel all of its power, yet he easily dodged the many methods of the will of the heavens and earth. With its super-powerful power, it easily maintained its independence and was not affected by the heavens and earth. Of course, the pressure that the world was under was too great, so the world could only spare a tiny bit of attention to Luo Fan. It could only use an unknown fraction of its methods on him. This was also an important reason why the world could only use an unknown fraction of its methods on him. After all, the world was currently facing a great calamity. This kind of tribulation was even enough to completely destroy the world, leaving not a bit of substance or power in the world. Moreover, it was triggered in advance. Under such circumstances, even if the world wholeheartedly resisted the tribulation, it would not have enough strength. How could it have any spare strength to deal with Luo Fan? Even if Luo Fan was more powerful and terrifying than all the other cultivators in the world, he was still insignificant in the grand scheme of things. Luo Fan carefully observed the vortex in the depths of the void and distinguished the endless connections that existed within it. Very soon, he found what he wanted to find from it. An existence that had never appeared in the world before, one that was even grander, more vast, and more terrifying than the world's will, gradually emerged. It was a peculiar existence that was faintly discernible, seemingly illusory, yet also real. Wherever it was, it filled the entire world. It was as if it was an incomparably scattered existence. However, it vaguely maintained a complete whole, as if it was more complete and compact than all the other entities in the world. As expected, the source of the world's calamity has appeared. After carefully distinguishing for a while, Luo Fan revealed a strange smile. This grand, vast, and indescribable thing was none other than the source of the world's calamity. The source filled every inch of space and time in the world at this moment. Its power was closely connected to the boundless baleful aura in the world, vaguely forming an indescribable suppression on the world's will. Under this suppression, the world's will seemed to need to focus 99% of its power on resisting the suppression in order to prevent itself from collapsing and being destroyed. The remaining portion of its power was dispersed to all living beings, all matter, all laws, time, and space to help them resist the various special manifestations of the great tribulation of the heavens and earth. In other words, it was resisting the waves of tribulations that were born from the great tribulation of the heavens and earth. It was precisely because the world's will needed to resist the source of the calamity that Luo Fan was able to break free from the world's corrosion and control so easily. Of course, it was an extremely great pressure for the world's will. For the world's calamity, resisting the world's will wasn't an easy task. At this moment, the source of the calamity had also focused 99% of its power on suppressing the world's will. Only then did the power beneath him spread throughout the world, forming wave after wave of tribulations that targeted all matter, all power, and all living beings in the world. It was precisely because of this that Luo Fan could so easily repel the power of the great tribulation of heaven and earth, turning the area within hundreds of thousands of miles around him into a forbidden area that the great tribulation of heaven and earth couldn't approach. It was also because of this that he was countless times stronger than before. After all, this was the world's calamity. Normally speaking, it was an existence that even the world had to resist with all its might. Yet now, he was able to easily repel the heavenly tribulation of the heavens and earth, allowing the place he was at to not be affected by the heavenly tribulation of the heavens and earth. In the eyes of others, he'd simply far surpassed the heavenly tribulation of the heavens and earth, and he'd become an existence that not even the heavenly tribulation of the heavens and earth dared to provoke. As expected, compared to the world's calamity, the world is still at a disadvantage. Luo Fan made a judgment in his heart after seeing the source of the world's will and the calamity. At this moment, it wasn't the world's will that gained the upper hand, but the world's calamity. In this confrontation, although the world will wasn't pushed back, its aura was gradually being suppressed. The vortex in the depths of the void was also slowly deforming, as if it needed a lot of support to barely maintain the vortex's existence. On the other hand, the source of the world's calamity was constantly gathering, as if it was about to condense into a state that was opposite to the vortex. One was about to collapse, while the other was about to condense. It was clear who had the upper hand. At this moment, a spot of light appeared in the vortex that was the manifestation of the world's will. Following this spot of light, the vortex began to tremble slightly, and its state of collapse began to quickly stabilize, as if it had suddenly received some strange replenishment. Luo Fan looked over, and he knew what the spot of light represented. That spot of light was the existence that corresponded to Duan Ji. With his participation, the world should be able to gain the upper hand. Looking at the spot of light constantly swimming along the vortex's flow, Luo Fan made up his mind. Duan Ji was just a cultivator. Compared to the world, he was insignificant. However, don't forget that he was a despair cultivator with an extremely profound cultivation, an existence that was far more powerful than a fake saint. Compared to the current level of the cultivation world in this world, such an existence was already a few streets away. In this world, except for Duan Ji, the strongest cultivator was only a pseudo-saint. Duan Ji did not even need to make a move. With just a thought, he could erase thousands of existences. Under such circumstances, his participation could directly raise the cultivation level of the entire world by several levels, directly elevating the world of cultivation to an unimaginable level. This sublimation caused all living beings in the world to be able to provide assistance to the world, as well as their ability to resist the tribulation of the world, to become several times stronger than before. Just like that, on an invisible level, in other words, on the level of the world's will, his existence was naturally enough to greatly strengthen the world's will, thus changing the disadvantage that the world's will was in. Although the world's will had gradually gained the upper hand, Luo Fan still did not relax. He still carefully sensed the vortex and the source of the world's calamity. He carefully grasped the situation of the battle between the two, and was ready to make a move at any time. This kind of invisible battle was real to Luo Fan, but to the other cultivators in this world, it was completely illusory. Chapter 2372. After attaining the highest position, Duan Shi's unimaginable cultivation realm was able to unleash a power that was thousands of times stronger. Initially, despite his profound cultivation realm, he was only a cultivator, an individual. No matter how powerful he was, the area he could protect during the great tribulation of heaven and earth was only a few 100 million light-years away. Compared to the entire world, it was not even 1,000th of the area. However, when he obtained the highest position in this world and became the alliance master of the highest palace, the situation would obviously be different. Under his outstanding gaze and superb command, the various forces that originally existed in the world were deeply integrated. Not only could they fully unleash 30% to 40% of their original power, but they could even surpass it and unleash 200%, 300%, 400%, and even 1,000% of their original power. It sounded abstract, but it was actually very simple when one looked at it in detail. Originally, although the various powers in the world could not be considered to have their own way, the connection between them was too thin. They could not coordinate with each other at all. In some places, the methods of the living beings in those places would not have much effect on the great tribulation of heaven and earth. However, if they were in another place and faced the attack of the great tribulation of heaven and earth, the effect would be unimaginable. Similarly, the methods of the living beings in other places might not be effective against the great tribulation of heaven and earth, but they might be equally effective against the great tribulation of heaven and earth. Just like that, when Duan Shi was not in control, Even the fake Saint Realm leader could not change the situation because he was already exhausted from the great tribulation of heaven and earth. It was already difficult for him to protect the area he was in charge of, so how could he have the chance to change the areas the living beings were in charge of? Moreover, due to his insufficient cultivation realm and knowledge, he could only wait until the great tribulation of heaven and earth erupted to find out which cultivators would have the best effect against the great tribulation of heaven and earth. However, that was obviously too slow. Perhaps those cultivators would have already died because the great tribulation of heaven and earth was not their expertise. In comparison, the situation would be completely different if the great tribulation of heaven and earth fell under Duansher's control. Duansher had enough strength, enough knowledge, and enough cultivation to support him to distinguish all of this ahead of time. He also had enough energy to arrange all of this. In this way, the various tribulations encountered by the world would naturally be dealt with in the best way possible. In the end, it allowed the power of heaven and earth to achieve the effect of using little effort to resist the many tribulations that heaven and earth had encountered. This kind of change was not the only one that happened after Duansher obtained the highest position. In fact, it was innumerable. The combination of all these factors caused the situation of the entire world to change. The world, which had been retreating under the onslaught of the great tribulation of heaven and earth, was quickly reversed. Although the state of the world was still extremely miserable after the situation was reversed, with slaughter, death, and all sorts of destruction, it was much better than the chaos and despair from before. Over 300 years later, when the calamity of the heavens and earth and the battle between the heavens and earth reached a balance, Duansher finally let out a sigh of relief as the person with the highest position in the heavens and earth. Although the situation of the heavens and earth had gradually turned around and there was gradually some hope amidst the despair, hope was still just hope. In the end, he did not see the future of the heavens and earth surviving the calamity. Until now, when the battle between the world and the great tribulation of the heavens and earth had reached a state of equilibrium, and neither side was able to suppress the other. Only then did he truly believe that the world truly had the future to overcome the great tribulation of the heavens and earth. As long as this continues, the heavens and earth will be saved. On this day, Duansher, who was reflecting the countless battles that broke out in the heavens and earth with his 3 eyes, had such a thought. As he thought about this, his gaze narrowed slightly. It had originally been scattered to countless places in the world, and it focused on a certain place that he cared about the most. It was a place that was not affected by the great tribulation of heaven and earth's baleful aura for the past 300 years. It was also not affected by any resistance from the heavens and earth. It was the place where his teacher lived. There was no difference from the past 300 years. It was still as calm and ordinary as ever, as if it was independent of the heavens and earth, and was not affected by anything in the heavens and earth. Such an existence naturally revealed an indescribable transcendence amidst the peacefulness, causing Duansher to feel an indescribable complicated emotion. The emotion was a child's admiration, envy, yearning, and a touch of resentment. Needless to say, there were positive emotions such as admiration, envy, and yearning. As his master's residence, he naturally placed all the positive emotions he had for his master in this position. It was natural for positive emotions such as admiration, envy, and yearning to appear. And the faint resentment and negative emotions were actually not something inconceivable. After all, he had been struggling hard in the heavens and earth in the outside world for 300 years. During this period, he had racked his brains and almost stimulated his potential to the limit. He did not even have a moment to relax. However, in such a calm and peaceful place, his master was watching the clouds roll by and relax, enjoying the beauty of life and cultivation. How could he not feel inexplicable resentment when faced with such a strong contrast? However, although he felt resentment, he also knew that it was impossible for him to shake his master's will. As long as his master was unwilling, no matter what he said or how he begged, he would not listen to him. Therefore, even though he had such complicated emotions, he did not disturb his master. He only cast a complicated gaze at him occasionally. Duan sure thought that he had seen everything, but he did not know that the war between the heavens and earth and the great tribulation of heaven and earth was happening at a level that he could not sense. At the same time, it was even more unbelievable and direct. All of this was reflected in Luo Fan's eyes at this moment. It was the huge vortex in the deepest part of the void, as well as the source of the great tribulation of heaven and earth that shrouded the vortex and filled the entire heavens and earth. While the various tribulations and living beings in the heavens and earth fought against the heavens and earth for 300 years, the vortex that was the manifestation of the heavens and earth's will and the source of the great tribulation of heaven and earth were also engaged in an extremely intense battle. The battle seemed to be invisible, but compared to the various tribulations in the heavens and earth below, it was thousands of times more intense. Amidst the battle, the vortex was constantly enduring a terrifying impact. The source of the great tribulation of heaven and earth was constantly wearing down the heavens and earth's will. The heavens and earth's will were also constantly attacking the source of the great tribulation of heaven and earth, causing the source of the great tribulation of heaven and earth to be constantly worn down by the impact. Over the past 300 years, the heavens and earth's will and the source of the great tribulation of heaven and earth had become more violent and dangerous. It was as if any change could easily crush them 300 years ago. However, in terms of the source, they were already countless times weaker than they were 300 years ago. With Luo Fan's gaze, he could even see an indescribable fatigue and powerlessness in the two of them. At this moment, the violence of the two of them even gave him a feeling of the final radiance of the setting sun. Still not enough. I have to continue waiting. Looking at the two of them, Luo Fan, who had not moved for 300 years, had this thought flash across his mind. With this thought in mind, he forcibly suppressed his original impulse to attack, making him fall silent once more. He quietly waited for the situation to continue developing, waiting for the two of them to continue to weaken as they clashed in this stalemate. The flow of time seemed to have sped up. Before he knew it, another 3,000 years had passed. During these 3,000 years, the chaos in this world had become the norm. Compared to 3,000 years ago, the entire world had become many times more dilapidated. However, for the many living beings in this world, the various negative emotions in their hearts were much less than before. The reason for this was actually very simple. This was because although the situation in this world was slowly deteriorating, it was still in a state of balance. This state of balance gave all living beings in this world the feeling that this world could still exist for a very long time. It was even to the extent that to the numerous living beings that had been born in the last 3,000 years, the world in their knowledge was an extremely adverse state where attacks from tribulations were descending at all times, and it was a state that was enveloped by boundless baleful energy at all times. Under such circumstances, it was natural that very few of them were really resentful to the point of having strong negative emotions towards this world. Most of them had already accepted the current state of this world. They accepted that this world was in such chaos, such danger, and such a state where living beings could die at any moment. When will this great calamity of this world subside? In the highest palace that had been rebuilt, Duan Sure muttered in an inexplicable tone. At this moment, he was once again filled with despair from the bottom of his heart. 3,000 years ago, when the situation in this world finally fell into a state of balance, he had strong hope that this world would be able to survive this calamity. He even felt relieved. However, after 3,000 years of development, although the original balance still existed, it was only maintaining this balance. It was not developing in a good direction as he had imagined, gradually leading this world towards victory and stability. In these 3,000 years, The situation in this world was more than 1,000 times worse than it was 3,000 years ago. How could he still maintain his original thoughts? At this moment, he could no longer suppress the urge to look for his teacher and ask him for help. At this moment, the Stage 2 pseudo-sage clone shuddered as if he had received some information. His expression changed drastically, and he got up to report to Duan Shi, Alliance leader. The Alliance of Chaos has suddenly made a move. They have already destroyed the southwest fortress. Hearing this, Duan Shi's expression changed drastically, and he said, "The Alliance of Chaos dares to do this? When did this happen? They started attacking 10 breaths ago, and 8 breaths ago, they completely destroyed the southwest fortress, razing the entire fortress and all the cultivators in it to the ground." The Stage 2 pseudo-sage clone said with an extremely ugly expression. 2 breaths? Duan Shi's expression changed even more. In that instant, a tremendous aura burst forth from his body, causing the entire hall to tremble and collapse. It seemed as if it had been formed by countless tiny fragments piled up together. Fortunately, the aura of the broken world was extremely profound. The instant the palace was destroyed, it condensed again, and with a slight change, the countless fragments were glued back together, restoring the palace to a flawless state. It was as if time had been reversed once more. However, the hall could be restored in an instant, but the clones of the cultivators in the hall did not have such a good thing. After the corrosion of the tribulations over 3,000 years, there were now less than 1,000 cultivators left in the hall. At this moment, under the impact of Duan Shi's aura, 80% of the clones of the less than 1,000 cultivators were completely destroyed. Only 20% of the clones could still survive in the hall. However, even the clones of the cultivators that survived were all injured, and they looked many times more miserable than before. Duan Shi did not pay attention to the changes in the hall. At this moment, his heart was filled with shock and anger. The Alliance of Chaos was an alliance that corresponded to the Supreme Alliance of Chaos. It was an alliance formed by the creatures that came from the depths of the abyss in the southwest wastelands and had the marks of chaotic creatures. Apart from this alliance, there was also an alliance called the Alliance of Overlord. In other words, they stood on the side of the Supreme Alliance of Chaos. The Alliance of Overlords was none other than the alliance formed by the clones of the tribulations.